Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for another beautiful day, Lord, a day that you've given us to serve you. And we just pray tonight, Lord, that as we gather together to worship you and just to study your wonderful creation, that, Lord, you answer those questions that are upon our hearts. Father, there's so many things out there and so many ideas about evolution and creation. We just want to know the truth, Lord. And we trust your word, we trust you, and we just pray for Jay tonight, Lord, that the words you've given to him would just minister to our hearts and our lives. We love you, Lord, so much. We also pray for our worship tonight that it would be pleasing in your sight. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Because they see that there's got to be a designer, there's got to be a creator, there's got to be a God. It's not a matter of the intellect, it's a matter of the heart. It's a spiritual battle that we face. And so, yes, I think it's good that we are prepared to answer questions that people have for us, but also understand that when you go and share your faith with people, that you lay down prayer, that God would open their eyes, soften their heart to the truth. So with that said, we'll let Jay come up and share tonight. Let's welcome him again.
All about. I don't do things outside of the box very often. I'm actually a pretty shy person, and I'm not talking about creation, evolution, and the Bible and all that. But my wife texted me this afternoon, and she asked if her scarf was in the back of my car, and I said, "Yeah, I've been wearing it while I've been speaking." And she thought that was really funny because she says, "You know what? When you try to be funny, you're not funny." But she said that was funny that I said that I was wearing it. She said, "You have to send me a picture of you wearing it." Now, she was just being sarcastic. She knew I wouldn't do that. So I just sent it to her here in a text, and she's gonna she's gonna freak out when she sees that I actually put it on, because that's not me at all. I usually don't have enough courage to do something like that. So now we got that out of the way. Tonight, the last talk here. Anyone not be here in any of the previous sessions? Oh, a few of you. Okay. We're kind of wrapping things up here. This particular talk is going to be like 99% science on purpose, because a lot of people say, "Don't give me all that Bible stuff. I don't even believe in the Bible. I'm just into science and all that." And so we're kind of doing that tonight. We're going to see, what does science really say in a number of areas. We're going to look at the origin of the universe, origin of life, and origin of species, primarily from a scientific standpoint, and see what we learn from that. We're just going to be scratching the surface. We could go on for days and weeks and months and years on this, scratching the surface to see, do we learn anything from science that would back up what the Bible's been telling us, or does it show us, no, the Bible's just crazy, it's just totally wrong? I think you're going to see pretty quickly, pretty easily here tonight, there's a lot of stuff in science that tells us, wow, the Bible's been right all along. So that's where we're headed with this particular talk, and then we'll do Q&A afterwards. Ask any questions you want, and then again, I'll be at the table for a little bit longer afterwards, and then I'm headed home after that. But it did mention we're going to look very quickly at the origin of the universe and origin of life. We'll spend most of our time looking at the origin of species, a variety of life, and without any other background, because there's a lot of things I could say, but I want to jump right into this because we need to move along so we can get to the Q&A. But we're going to look right away at the origin of the universe. No matter who you are, whether you're a Christian, an atheist, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Mormon, whoever you might be, your worldview, meaning the way you look at things, has to answer a number of basic questions. One of those questions is, how did it all begin? Meaning this universe, where did it come from? How did it begin? I think the Christian worldview is really the only one that can answer this question consistently, both philosophically and scientifically. So we're going to take a look at this very quickly here. And you've all heard of the Big Bang. You might wonder, okay, well, what is the Big Bang? And people would say, well, that's the origin of the universe. There's one very interesting thing about the Big Bang, and that is it doesn't explain the origin of the universe. They get, what do you mean? Yeah, it does. That's what it is. The Big Bang, this kind of threw stuff out into space and formed the universe. If that's your impression of the Big Bang, you're in good company, because most people believe that. In fact, probably most scientists believe that. But most scientists aren't studying this stuff. They're making rocket fuel, curing diseases, making cell phones and things like that. They're doing great stuff, but they're not studying the origin of the universe. But that's their impression. It was this kind of massive explosion that threw stuff out into space and kind of formed the universe. But the scientists who actually study this, they say, no, that's a misconception. This is what they believe, that in the beginning, everything in the entire known universe that we know of right now was squished down into a tiny little speck, maybe the size of an electron. They actually say it was of infinite density, this little speck. Now, I know what you're picturing. This speck kind of floating around in space. Nope. It wasn't floating around in space because space didn't exist yet. It's just a speck. And I know what you're thinking. Okay, the speck is kind of hanging out, waiting to form the universe. No, it's not waiting. Time doesn't exist yet. Oh, that's bizarre. That's what they believe. There was a speck sitting in nothing, not waiting for anything, because space and time don't exist yet. That's what they call the singularity. What is a singularity? A singularity is something that doesn't play well with the known laws of physics. It violates the laws of physics, but that's what they believe happened. Somehow there must have been different laws or something that allowed it to be there, and then the Big Bang is a magical event that kind of got it unstuck. They also call it a thermodynamic dead end. You can't go anywhere. It is stuck. But then the Big Bang somehow is the explanation of the expansion of this thing, and as it expanded, it was creating space, and it created time. If it sounds bizarre, you're paying attention. It is bizarre. It has nothing to do with known laws of science and physics today. It's something apart from that, but that's what they believe. So they want to be scientific about things, but yet it all starts off violating the known laws of physics. They have to kind of invent new laws that we don't know anything about to accommodate that. And the Big Bang itself is full of problems and things that it really can't explain. In fact, very recently, now they're saying, well, the theories of relativity and these equations we looked at, now it shows that the universe did not have a beginning. There wasn't a Big Bang. Really? You had all this great evidence and finding all these things and proving it, and many Christians were jumping on the bandwagon and say, well, okay, yeah, they've proven the Big Bang. That's how God did it. Yep, there's scientific proof of that. Well, what are the Christians going to do when scientifically it looks like maybe there wasn't a Big Bang? And the Christians would have to say, well, okay, then this new theory, that proves the Bible, that God did it that way. We shouldn't be so quick to jump on these theories, and they're not really even theories because they're not really testable, because when they're shown to be invalid, then we have to come up with excuses as to why, okay, that doesn't count, but the new one, that one's okay too. So I think we should be careful as Christians not to jump on these very nebulous, strange ideas about the origin of the universe. So it's going to go back and forth, evidence for it, evidence against it, back, all these things on and on. I'm going to write an article maybe next month with some more of these details because they're just coming out with some of these things now. But anyway, lots of problems with the Big Bang. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. We don't have, lots and lots of time to unearth all of this stuff. But here's an interesting quote from New Scientist magazine. This is Popular Science magazine. It said, in the beginning there was nothing. Then with the Big Bang, an almost infinitely small, hot and dense universe exploded into existence. Now, when I was reading that article, I had a question. You might have the same question. If there was really nothing to begin with, what exploded? They're the ones who said there was nothing. It's their article. But I thought, you know what? I'm going to give them a break. This is just the first page of the article. I'm sure they'll explain that. So I read the rest of the article. They never even mentioned it again. But boy, did they have a lot of detail. The rest of the Big Bang, all these minute mathematical details and all these things, and impressive statistics and the temperatures and sizes and all this. Like, wow, but wait a minute. They couldn't even explain what exploded when there was nothing to begin with. And they didn't even address that. That's not scientific. Then we have Discover magazine says this: the universe burst into something from absolutely nothing, zero, nada. And as it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere. Now, you really shouldn't laugh because this is a science magazine. These articles are generally written by PhD scientists who seriously are very intelligent. We'll do questions at the end, so remember your question, we'll pull that up. But what happens is, because this is a science magazine and the writers are usually scientists who are very intelligent, we just assume that it's science and that it must be true. But you know what? This isn't even a scientific statement. To say that everything came from nothing, That's a philosophical statement. That's their belief that everything came from nothing. That actually goes against the known science that we have. First law of thermodynamics, you can't get something from nothing. Nothing's ever violated that principle, but yet their idea, the origin of the universe, violates that. They say, well, it must have happened because we're here. So again, we assume this is a scientific statement and it must be true because scientists write this. Well, yeah, they can write whatever they want, but it doesn't mean that everything they say is science. Here's one other quote from New Scientist magazine. I like this quote a lot better. This has to do with how do you get something out of nothing. It says, what is the big deal? The biggest deal of all is how you get something out of nothing. Don't let the cosmologists try to kid you on this one. They have not got a clue either. In the beginning, they will say, there was nothing. No time, space, matter, or energy. Then there was a quantum fluctuation from which, whoa, stop right there. You see what I mean? First there is nothing and then there is something. And the cosmologists try to bridge the two with a quantum flutter, a tremor of uncertainty that sparks it all off. Then they are away, and before you know it, they have pulled 100 billion galaxies out of their quantum hats. You cannot fudge this by appealing to quantum mechanics. Either there is nothing to begin with, in which case there is no quantum vacuum, no pre-geometric dust, no time in which anything can happen, no physical laws that can affect a change from nothingness into somethingness, or there is something, in which case that needs explaining. And it's really that simple. Either there truly was nothing to begin with, in which case nothing is going to happen because nothing can do nothing but nothing. That's why we call it nothing. Or there really was something in the beginning, in which case that needs explaining. What was that something? Where did it come from? How did it get here? How did it turn into an entirely orderly universe? They don't have real scientific answers to that. A lot of hand-waving and philosophical stuff and belief systems, but no real science. We're going to look at something next called the anthropic principle. It has to do with the idea that the universe looks like it's designed or set up just right for life to be possible. All these different factors. There's over hundreds of examples here. There's over 30 just in cosmology, the study of the universe itself. And we're going to look at just 2 examples here. And we're going to start out with a simple analogy. Let's say you went over to a friend's house and they just moved in and you're looking around and you're saying, wow, what a beautiful home. Did you guys hire a professional decorator? They said, no, we're actually really upset. The movers went to the old house, packed everything up in the truck, got to the new house, opened the door, and they literally just threw everything in there, and that's how it landed. I mean, would you believe them for a second? Obviously not. There's no way they're throwing everything in there and the coffee table's perfectly centered on the rug and the love seat and sofa at 90-degree angles and lamps perfectly centered on the coffee tables and pictures hung on the wall and all that. You could see someone set this up the way they wanted it. It's not an accident. It's the same thing with our universe. It doesn't look like this massive explosion that kind of threw stuff out or whatever, and it all turned out to be just right for life to be possible. Now, we're going to look at just 2 examples. We're going to try to keep things simple here. First one is the gravitational constant, force of gravity. Here's a formula that shows us the force of gravity between 2 objects. This capital G here is the gravitational constant. This number at the bottom, that's the value for the gravitational constant. I have a picture of the sun up there as a reminder for me to tell a story I usually share. When I was studying for my degree in physics, I was calculating things all the time, over and over and over. And I graduated and found out I didn't really have to calculate a lot of stuff anymore. And I was on an airplane for my first job going somewhere one day, and for some reason I was just bored out of my skull. I wanted to do something to pass the time. And I thought, maybe I could calculate something. That always takes time. So I was looking out the window of the airplane, and I saw the sun rising. I wondered to myself, I wonder if I could calculate the mass of the sun just from what I remembered in my head from physics. It's kind of bizarre. You might not want to make eye contact with me later. But I remembered this formula, so I wrote it down on a piece of paper. And I remembered another formula, so I wrote that down. I did some calculus on it, and I came up with a number. I had no idea if I was anywhere close to being right. I got home later, got out my physics book, looked up the value. I was 0.1% off. I was like, that's pretty cool. I was just flying on an airplane. I calculated the mass of the sun. Kind of bizarre again, but the point here is that this stuff works. Creationists do not reject science. Again, as I mentioned before, almost every major area of science we have today was founded by a Bible-believing Christian. We love science. It works great. But the bigger question for us tonight is, why is this gravitational constant this particular value and not something else? Because scientists tell us that if there was a Big Bang, this value could have ended up just about anywhere. In fact, they say if you had a ruler that was so long it would reach from one end of the universe to the other end, that's a long ruler, every inch on that ruler would represent a different possible value for this constant. If there was a Big Bang, it could have ended up anywhere on the ruler all the way across the universe. Well, let's put an arrow here. Let's say that that's where it is today. What if there was a Big Bang and it wasn't there? It ended up somewhere else. We could move this arrow halfway across the universe to see how that would affect us. We're not going to do that. We're going to move this thing just 1 inch. And what you see happens is that animals anywhere near the size of people are instantly crushed. Insects have to have very thick legs to support themselves, and creatures much bigger than that, they can't even survive. That's from messing with this constant a tiny bit. So you got this huge ruler all the way across the universe. You just bump this arrow 1 inch, and basically life isn't possible. So did we get lucky? There was a Big Bang, and this thing turned out to be right where it needs to be? Or could that be interpreted as evidence of design? I think it fits in fairly well with the design aspect. That's just one example. There's tons we could go through. We're just going to look at one other one here, keeping it simple. The cosmological constant has to do with the energy density of empty space. You could forget about that detail. It's just another one of those factors in physics that has to be right where it is, or life's not possible. Well, what are the chances that this factor turned out right by accident? No God, no design, just random Big Bang, and it turned out right. Well, they've calculated that. They tell us the chances of this turned out right by accident would be 1 chance in 100 million, billion, 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 billion. In case you haven't studied math or science much yet, that's a big number. Really big. But what's more interesting, what are the chances that both of these two examples turn out right by accident? Not just one or the other, but both of them. Now, we could look at hundreds of them. We're just looking at 2 here. What are the chances that both of these turn out right by accident? Well, I calculated that too. Chances these two turn out right by accident would be 1 chance in 100 million, trillion, 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 trillion. That's just a crazy big number. I agree with Owen Gingerich, a Harvard astronomer, who said a common sense and satisfying interpretation of the world suggests a designing hand of a super intelligence. You know what? I also agree with the psalmist when he said, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. God is the one who created this universe, and his fingerprints are all over it. We're just looking at probabilities here. You know what? That's all we're going to say about the origin of the universe, because we have very limited time here this evening. There's tons else we could say, but we've got to move on. We're going to look very briefly at the origin of life. There are 2 things that evolutionists don't like to talk about a whole lot. One we covered very, very quickly. How do you get something out of nothing, and how does that nothing turn into an entirely orderly universe? The second one is, how do you get non-living chemicals to form a living cell? This is such a big problem that most evolutionists say, no, it's not our problem. We don't deal with that. We just deal how one creature slowly changes into another one. But wait a minute, how do you get that first creature? You got to start with a single-celled organism that turns into other life forms. How do you get life started? Well, it's not our issue. Yeah, it really is. It's part of the big picture. They even have courses on organic evolution and the origin of life and all that. So that's got to be part of their worldview. They can't just jump in the middle and say, well, we're going to take it from here on. Well, what happened before that? A miracle? You guys won't allow for that. So they do have to address this. Well, back in the 1950s, Stanley Miller put an experiment together in the laboratory trying to see if he could simulate what he thought the Earth might have been like almost 4 billion years ago. Why did he do that? He wanted to see if whatever atmosphere the Earth supposedly had back then could create amino acids. Why did he want amino acids? Well, amino acids are building blocks for life. Now, they're not life. They're not even close to life, but you got to start somewhere. If you get the right kind of amino acids together just the right way, you might be able to get a protein. Protein isn't even close to life, but if you get the right kinds of proteins in the right way and fold them just right and all that, you might get a living cell. You got to start somewhere. So he put this experiment together, put some gases in there, methane, ammonia, hydrogen. But there's one gas he left out here, oxygen. Why did he leave that out? Because he knew if oxygen existed in this atmosphere, it would destroy things and you wouldn't get the amino acids you wanted. So he decided to leave it out. Someone else said, well, wait a minute, if the Earth didn't have oxygen, there would have been no ozone layer on the Earth. Ozone is O3. If you don't have an ozone layer around the Earth, the sun's ultraviolet light rays come through and destroy things. So you're not going to get your amino acids. So with it, you got a problem. Without it, you got a problem. Well, he's in a laboratory, doesn't have to worry about sunlight, so he just said, well, the Earth's ancient atmosphere did not have oxygen. And then he circulates things around here, and then he introduces some sparks here to simulate lightning on a primeval Earth, because you got to energize all this. Then there's one other thing they didn't like to draw a lot of attention to, and that's at the bottom here, called a trap. If they formed anything in this atmosphere, they had to trap it out the bottom and not let it stay in this atmosphere because it would be destroyed hundreds of times faster than it would form. You're not going to accumulate anything. How's that going to happen on the Earth? You form something in the Earth's atmosphere, and then you have to trap it out of the Earth's atmosphere just to keep it from dying off. Not realistic at all. Well, this is what they formed. 85% of what they formed was a toxic tar, harmful to life. 13% were carboxylic acids, also toxic to life. And then 2% of what they formed were amino acids. That's what they were looking for. They got very excited, just about claimed they had created life in a laboratory. Well, there was a problem with this. They didn't like to draw attention to this either. These amino acids they created came in two forms, left-handed and right-handed. Half left-handed, half right-handed. Why is that an issue? Because life only consists of left-handed amino acids. Let's keep this simple. Let's say you have an absolutely huge bag, billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of red and blue blocks, half red, half blue, all mixed up. You're blindfolded and you have to reach in this bag and pull out just red blocks. These are your left-handed amino acids, the ones you want. Every time you reach in the bag, you got a 50-50 chance of getting a red one. So you want to pull them out because you want to build a chain of those to maybe get a protein. So you reach in the first time, 50-50 chance to get a red one, great, put it on the table. Reach in the second time, 50-50 chance to get another red one, put it on the table. You have a chain of 2 now, great, no surprise. Third time, another red one. You get a little lucky, but no big deal. Fourth time, another red one. You're getting a little more lucky here now. Got to have a chain of 4. Fifth time, another red one. Well, this is your lucky day. A sixth time, oh, you got a blue one. You don't put that one back and grab a different one. That blue one just destroyed your chain of 5 red ones. Put them all back in, mix them up, start all over again. Think you're ever going to get 10 in a row? Probably not. How about 25 in a row? No, not in your lifetime. Well, you'd need at least 300 red blocks in a row to get the simplest protein, and a protein isn't even close to life. It is not going to happen this way. Here's a summary of the experiment. They had the wrong materials to begin with, they used the wrong conditions, they got the wrong results. Other than that, it was a great experiment. But what are the chances that just somehow life formed by accident? Because I actually have proof it happened. We are here today. That's what many scientists believe. It must have happened by accident, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to be talking about it. Because they won't even consider that maybe it was created or designed. They've already ruled that out. So therefore they say it must have happened, no matter how improbable it was, it just had to have happened or we wouldn't be here. Well, let's take a look at this. In order to do this, we've got to look at some big numbers. A million is pretty big. It's 1 with 6 zeros. You can write that as 10 raised to the 6th. That just means a 1 with 6 zeros after it. Pretty big number. Billion, much bigger. 1 with 9 zeros. You can write that as 10 to the 9th. It's a 1 with 9 zeros. If you have a 1 in a billion chance of something happening, that is not a very good chance. Doesn't say it's impossible, it just says not a very good chance. These numbers are way too small, though. We need a bigger number. How about the estimated number of electrons in the entire known universe? That'd have to be a fairly big number. Electrons are pretty small, 9.1 times 10 to the negative 31st kilograms, but you guys do that. And the universe is huge. So that's got a big, big number. Well, you can write that number as a 1 followed by 80 zeros after it. So forget everything I've said so far and just remember this. A 1 with 80 zeros after it is so big. It's about the number of electrons in the entire known universe. Big number. Okay. With that in mind, what are the chances that life formed by accident? The number I'm going to show you comes from Sir Frederick Hoyle. He was one of the world's leading astronomers. He was an atheist for most of his life. He came to the conclusion there must be a God just by studying math and science. These are his calculations. He told us the chances that this would happen by accident over all the supposed billions of years they say we've had is 1 chance in a 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. That is a crazy big number. Let's just write this number down for a second. We'll put a 1 on the screen and shove it up in the corner there, and then fill the screen with tiny zeros. That's page 1 of zeros, and we have page 2 of zeros, then page 3 of zeros, and then pages 4. And then 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 pages of tiny zeros just to write the number down. Would you like to have someone write you a check that big? But seriously, this number is so big that you're just thinking, wow, it's a big number, but you have like no clue of how big it is. It's just a big number. So let's use a simple analogy here. How many of you have ever played with a Rubik's Cube? Most of you have. The rest of you either too tired to raise your hands or you're lying. Rubik's Cubes are kind of fun. There's a lot of different combinations to a Rubik's Cube. In fact, if you are blindfolded and you're spinning away randomly, you have one chance in 10 million trillion of getting it right. Because that's how many combinations there are to a Rubik's Cube, and only one's correct. So no one in their right mind says, oh yeah, I could do that by accident. They all realize, okay, yeah, it's not going to happen by accident. So let's compare solving a Rubik's Cube by accident to life forming by accident. It would be like me walking up to one of you, handing you a Rubik's Cube, putting a blindfold on, you start spinning away randomly, and you solve the cube 2,105 times in a row, getting it right every single time. Is that ever going to happen? No, not even close. So why do we teach in every public school system and every state university that life happened 3.8 billion years ago when non-living chemicals came together to form a living cell? There are two things that I personally think we should not be teaching in the, now you got to listen to me carefully, in the public school science classroom and in the state university science classroom. One is that story that 3.8 billion years ago, non-living chemicals kind of came together and formed a living cell. The second thing is that we shouldn't be teaching there is that God created everything in 6 days. He created Adam and Eve in a garden. It was perfect. But they sinned and disobeyed God and got kicked out of the garden, and then God had to send his son Jesus Christ to die on a cross for their sins. Now, I actually happen to think that that's true for many, many reasons. But that doesn't need to be taught in the science classroom because a lot of that goes outside of the reach of science. Science is great, but it's limited, and it can't test many things like that. So you can't use science to try to test many of those aspects. There's an awful lot about evolution. Most of evolution can't be tested either in the laboratory. It's a story about what happened billions of years ago when we weren't around to see it and can't reproduce it and didn't, we can't record it, can't test it directly. So what should we teach in the science classrooms? Oh, here's a thought. We could tell the students that, you know what, as of today, scientifically, it doesn't look like chemicals can just come together to form a living cell. And then they can talk about plant pollination, fossils, and stuff like that. The students are plenty bright to figure out if it couldn't happen on its own by accident, must have been something else involved. And then go other places to try to find out some of those details. You don't have to tell them what to think, just teach them how to think. But now we just teach them what to think rather than how to think. Oh, 3.8 billion years ago, chemicals came together to form a living cell. Memorize that, it's going to be on the test, and you move on. It's like, wait a minute, how does that work? Well, we don't have any evidence for that, but we're working on it, So anyway, that's what I think they should be teaching. But I also agree with Job when he says, the Spirit of the God hath made me, the breath of the Almighty hath given me life. I think that God is the one who created life. There's a lot of good reasons to believe that scientifically. But here's a good question. What do we do if tomorrow or next week or next month scientists are able to create life in a laboratory? Will that disprove creation, disprove the Bible and all that? Think of it this way. Scientist comes on television tomorrow morning and says, ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited to announce to you that after 70 plus years of research, the most brilliant scientists on the planet, experimenting, using the most expensive equipment known to man, spending billions of dollars, we have finally created life in a laboratory, proving that no intelligence was necessary. It would have been just the opposite, right? I mean, you could ask this scientist, did you guys put any intelligence into your experiments? If he says no, he's not being honest. If he says yes, they will have proven it took a lot of intelligence. 70 plus years and the most brilliant brains trying to get things right. Now, if they want to throw some random goop in a corner somewhere and 1,000 years later there's life there, that would intrigue me. I'd want to know more about that. But experimenting and trying to get it just right doesn't say it happened by accident billions of years ago. It's nothing to do with that. It's just the opposite. But I guarantee you, and I don't think they'll be able to create life, but if they do, I guarantee you the first thing they'll say is, this is proof that it happened by accident billions of years ago. But you guys at least will know that, no, that doesn't make any sense. But the rest of the public will think, wow, you've proven that, you can't argue with that. Because we've kind of lost our ability to think anymore and think deeply and ask questions. So that's all we're going to say about the origin of life. Again, moving on to the last segment here, spend most of our time here, and it gets, I think, more interesting here. The origin of species, the variety of life we have on the planet. This is what most people are thinking about when they're thinking of evolution. One type of creature slowly changing to something a little bit different all the way up through primates and human beings. So we're going to talk about this here. Evolution does teach there was a single-celled organism that slowly changed into a human being, backpack and all, over almost 4 billion years. But if they were honest with us, they would say, well, it was actually a rock that evolved into a human being. Why would I say that? Because they teach the nebular hypothesis that there were swirling gases that formed our sun, and some of those gases kept swirling and formed the planets in our solar system. And our Earth was in a molten state and cooled down over millions and millions of years into a solid rock. And then somehow water got on this rock, maybe asteroids, comets hitting it melted, so we got water, and then chemicals came out of the rocks into the water, and then they formed a living cell, which turned into human beings. So they believe we evolved from a rock. But if you pictured it this way in the textbooks, no one's going to believe that. In fact, if you back that up further, the Big Bang produced hydrogen. As I mentioned before, the hydrogen, given enough time, turns into people. That sounds completely crazy, but that's what they really believe. Hydrogen will turn into people who then can explain the whole origin of the universe. Makes no sense, but that's truly, when you play it out, is what they teach. We're going to look at something next called the bait and switch technique. This used to be used in stores. It's actually illegal. And this is how it would work today if they were still doing it. Let's say that Best Buy was advertising a really cool flat panel television, and you can't believe the price on this thing. You think, I'm going to leave this seminar right now and get there before they close. So you get there and you say, I'm interested in that flat panel television you guys were advertising. And the salesman goes, yeah, that one. Well, we really don't have that one anymore, but if you like that one, you're really going to like this one over here. And they pull a switch on you, and they try to sell you something else that's more expensive, the quality isn't as good, and they make more profit on it. So it's a bait and switch. They baited you with one thing to get you in the store, but then when you got there, they pull the switch and try to sell you something else. That's illegal. They can't do that anymore. I think something similar happens with teaching evolution. I think the bait is they tell you it's an absolute fact that there was a single-celled organism almost 4 billion years ago that slowly turned into every other life form on this planet by accident. They tell you that's a fact. But then when it comes time to getting you in the store, in a sense, or telling you evidence for this, they pull the switch. And they typically show you varieties of animals, and they tell you stories of how one changed into another one. For example, here's some breeds of dogs up here. There's probably about 250 breeds of dogs on the planet today. I personally believe that every single one of these dogs that we have around today descended from a common ancestor that was more like a wolf. Now, that might sound surprising. You might be thinking, wait a minute, I didn't think you believed in evolution. I don't. You can breed today, actually, dogs, dingoes, coyotes, and wolves. They can all breed together. And you know what you get? You get something that looks a little bit like a dog, dingo, coyote, or wolf. You don't get a cucumber because they don't have genetic information to make cucumbers, but they can make something that looks a little bit like the wolf or the dog. You can breed a wolf and a dog, and you can get a wolf dog. That's real science. We see that happening all the time. In fact, you can breed wolves selectively, and over time you could produce something like a Dalmatian. Is a Dalmatian different than a wolf? Yeah. They call it a different species? Yeah, they do. I don't have a problem with that. You know how you get a Dalmatian from a wolf? You don't take the genetic information a wolf has and add new genetic information to it. You take the wide variety of genetic information a wolf has and you start getting rid of information till all you have left is information to make a little bit longer legs, floppy ears, spots on the fur and all that. And now you have a purebred Dalmatian. You can breed Dalmatians until you're blue in the face and you're never going to get the wolf back or a greyhound or chihuahua or anything else because that genetic information variety is gone. Purebreds are generally not as healthy and robust as other dogs or wolves that can handle changes in the environment because they have a variety of genes that they can express. Purebreds, they're very limited. They can, they're only going to produce the same thing over and over and over. So the Dalmatian's never going to get thick fur back because those genes are gone. So yes, it's different, and the way we got it, though, is by getting rid of information, not by adding it out of nowhere. Now, if evolution is true, what is the engine behind evolution that actually drives it, makes it go forward? Well, they tell us there are three major elements. We've got mutations, natural selection, and lots and lots and lots of time. We're just going to look at these first two very quickly here. Mutation, what's a mutation? Mutation is an accidental copying error. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, I think. There's lots of information on our DNA, which I gave some examples yesterday as well. So when copies are made, mistakes happen. There's a lot of information there. It's actually got a three-tiered system to catch these mistakes, but sometimes the mistakes make it all the way through these three tiers, which are very complex. How did that happen by accident to have these error-correcting systems, by random particles smashing together? But their three-tiered system is there, but sometimes it gets through those systems, and that's a mutation, gets passed on. It's a copying error. And these mutations produce some strange things once in a while, like two-headed turtles. Some people say, well, see, it's evolving. There is something new here. There's absolutely nothing new there. The turtle already had genetic information how to make nose, eyes, head, neck, shell, and legs. Just accidentally made an extra copy going the wrong way. If you use your imagination, you can see this guy can't even reproduce. He's not going anywhere. And the whole point here is that there's no new information. Just copied existing information. Usually it either shuffles it or destroys it. Mutations aren't creating new information, which is what evolution would require. It requires a new information all along the way for millions and millions and millions of years. And not just new random information, information that's very complex and can work together to produce new features. Well, the second element that supposedly drives evolution is natural selection, or survival of the fittest. And this is how it works. Let's say you have two dogs here, a husky and a greyhound, and they're living in the same area. And let's say that over time the climate starts to change, it starts to get really cold out. You know, global warming's kicking in, it gets cold out. Don't get me started on that one. Which one of these dogs is going to survive the best in the cold climate? Obviously the huskies. They're well suited for cold climates, they survive, they reproduce, they have a lot of husky puppies. But the greyhounds die out. Natural selection truly does explain the survival of the fittest. But what it does not explain is the arrival of the fittest. How did we get huskies and greyhounds to begin with? Natural selection absolutely cannot create anything new. It just works with what already exists, and it gets rid of some of the stuff. It's going downhill. It is a perfectly valid scientific concept, but it has nothing to do with evolution. Unfortunately, most people think it was Charles Darwin that came up with this idea, and it's proof of evolution. No, it was actually a scientist who was a creationist, Edward Blythe, who thought of it 24 years before Darwin even wrote about it. And again, it's a perfectly valid scientific concept, and it fits in with Scripture that God created everything perfect to begin with, but because of sin and the curse that came into His creation, things have been going downhill ever since. And with the changes in the environment and these mutations, some things die out. So natural selection, yeah, explains the survival of the fittest, it explains how we get rid of things, but it doesn't explain how you get new things. The third element that drives evolution is lots and lots of time. We don't have time to talk about time. It's a really, really interesting subject. I have a whole other talk on, a couple talks on it, but we'll have to skip that for now. If you want to bring up some questions during Q&A, you're certainly welcome to do that. Well, we started out talking about evidence of design in the universe. We're going to end with talking about evidence of design in living things. And the point is, when you see design, it implies a designer. Just like when you see a painting, we got some paintings on the wall over there. When you see paintings, it implies there was a painter. Even if you've never met the painter, even if the painter died 500 years ago, you know, at some point in the past, there was a painter, or you wouldn't have the painting. So that's what we're going to look at. Now, if you were walking out in the desert and you saw some sand like this, you probably wouldn't think much about it. Literally, the wind blowing across the desert will form sand this way. No big deal. But if you saw sand that looked like this, you wouldn't think the same thing. Nobody thinks that the wind blowing on the beach forms these sand castles. I got to see them make some one day, and it's like just really cool. Obviously, someone much more gifted than me crafted them. You can see design here. Even if you can't quite describe how is it that you know they were designed, you just know it's obvious. It's intuitive. You know it when you see it. Well, here's an interesting quote from Francis Crick, again, the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, brilliant scientist. This is what he said. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why would he say that? Because when he looked at things, he could see they certainly looked designed, but he wanted to remind the other scientists, remember, it looks designed, but it's not, it just evolved. Why should he have to remind them? Can't they figure that out on their own? No, he's afraid they're going to conclude it was designed. And again, I mentioned it yesterday, even he himself realized, okay, yeah, it was designed by aliens. You know, we talked about that yesterday. See, it just screams design. Then we have Richard Dawkins, who said this, biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Maybe, just maybe, they look designed because they were designed. But he can't consider that because he's an atheist. He's already decided there is no God, so it can't be designed. It just looks designed. It's very convenient, but I think it's evidence for design when you see that. How would you know when you're seeing the evidence of design that's designed versus evidence of design that's not designed? It's his philosophy that gets him to say, no, it just looks that way. Then we have Charles Darwin himself. When he wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, again, he wasn't inventing evolution. It had been around a long time, but he popularized it. But he made a statement that we today can use to evaluate whether his idea is accurate or not, is trustworthy or not, is true or not, by using his own words. This is what he said. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. What did he mean by that? He was saying, if we ever find something in nature that's so complex, you have all these interworking parts that work together just the right way, his theory, well, I'll use the word theory, it's not really a theory, it doesn't qualify as one, but his theory would break down. It doesn't work. Why? Because if you need all these parts working together at the same time the right way, then you can't evolve one piece at a time until they're all there. It's not going to function until they're all there. Well, we have found many things like this in nature that show us that he was wrong. And it has to do with something we call irreducible complexity. This comes from a book called Darwin's Black Box by Dr. Michael Behe. And what it has to do with is that certain things, you can't make them any simpler and still have them work. They're as simple as they can be and still work. Any simpler, they're not going to function. And the analogy he used was brilliant, very easy to understand. That is the mousetrap. You're all familiar with a mousetrap. A mousetrap has 5 parts to it. It has a hammer, that's the mouse's least favorite part. Then you have the trigger where you put the cheese. Then you have the spring. Then you have the latch that holds it all back. And then you have the wooden base that holds all the pieces together. 5 parts. So if you were to take just one part away, how well would the mousetrap work? Would it work 4/5 as well? No, it wouldn't work at all. You take that hammer away, there's nothing to trap the mouse. You take the spring away, there's nothing to bring it over. You take the wooden base away, there's nothing to hold the pieces together, and so on. You need all 5 parts at the right place at the right time for this to function. So a mousetrap could not evolve by accident one piece at a time. Now, I know a mousetrap isn't living, it doesn't evolve. This is just an analogy. I was giving a lecture at a state university, and afterwards we did Q&A, and professor stood up. He was very arrogant, and he just said, you use that analogy of the mousetrap. You can't use non-living things as analogies. And I said, sure you can. We use simple analogies of everything someone can relate to get the idea across, and then you talk about real life. He goes, well, I said, don't you use analogies in your classroom? Which he did. He goes, yeah, but you have to use living things. I said, I did. As soon as I finished that analogy, we went on to a living thing. We spent a lot of time in it, and we're going to look at it here tonight. And we're going to look at 2 things. The last one will go really quick, but the first one, we're going to look at the human ear. Now, you've probably seen these things before. You might know a little bit about hearing. I'm going to go through a little more detail about hearing tonight. And if it seems like I'm going through a lot of detail, it's only because I'm going through a lot of detail. But I'm going to go through it fast. And here's the challenge. I want you to, at least for tonight, assume you're all evolutionists. Now, maybe some people here do actually believe in evolution, but for now, let's say we all believe in evolution. I want you to imagine how this thing that I'm going to describe to you evolved one piece at a time by accident. It's not like you have some creature in the past that didn't have ears, and it's thinking to itself, you know what, I've heard a lot of great things about ears, so when I reproduce, I'm going to try to make mistakes in my DNA, and hopefully my kids and grandchildren will make mistakes too, and eventually our great, whatever grandchildren will have ears, and they're just going to love them. It's not how evolution works. They're not trying to do anything. I don't know of an evolutionist on the planet who believes that. They say, no, it's just accidental copying errors. It's not like a creature needs something, so it tries to evolve it, although the popular literature will talk about that some creature needed wings, or it needed to breathe air, or needed this, and so it evolved that ability. No, it can't do that. It can't try to do that. So imagine how this happened by accident. So we're going to start out looking at sound. We have a speaker up here. The way a speaker works is by the vibration of a paper or plastic cone that moves in and out. It vibrates back and forth. And when it moves out, it compresses the air particles in front of it. Now when it moves back, it decompresses or pulls the particles apart. Squishes them, pulls them apart, back and forth. And then eventually the particles that are in your ear, they start vibrating back and forth. It's not like a single bullet that travels from the speaker all into your ear, all the way into your ear. It's like pool balls on a pool table, one hitting the next, all the way until the particles in your ear start vibrating back and forth. Then it travels about 740 miles an hour. That's sound. Okay, here's the ear. We're going to look at the outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear very quickly. Start looking at the outer ear. Thing that sticks out the side of your head is called the auricle. Just happens to be shaped in such a way to capture sound frequencies that your brain can interpret. I have been using a remote for my presentation this whole weekend, and it doesn't seem like it's bothering anybody because your brain's not even picking up on that. but your ear will capture the sound frequencies that your brain can interpret. Now, most of us have a very small bump in the back of our ear here. Probably never really noticed that. The reason I'm showing you this is actually evidence we've evolved from ape-like creatures. Now, some of you are laughing and the rest of you are thinking, this guy is just not funny. This is actually not my humor. This is off of an evolutionary website, and they're serious about this, which tells you they're really kind of hurting for evidence if that's supposed to be evidence we've evolved from an ape-like creature. But getting back to the ear here, we have the external auditory canal, the tube that goes into your ear. Now, you've probably seen one of these mechanical devices before. Hopefully use it once in a while. You don't want to take one of those things and jam it all the way in your ear. That would be a bad thing. So how do you get all the stuff that accumulates in your ear here? You can reach out here, but in here, there's a lot of dust and dirt and soot that gets trapped in there. Well, scientists have been studying, they determined that the cells that line this canal here, they're the only cells in your entire body that grow sideways. It's like a conveyor belt. Traps all that stuff and it moves it out for you, and then you can reach it when it's out here. Isn't that cool? That just happened by accident. We had some information to make us, and we made mistakes in copying it, and hey, now we got cells that grow sideways right where we need it. Aren't we lucky that the cells in our eyes don't grow sideways? They wouldn't be able to see anything, but they go sideways there. And the wax that's in your ear that traps those things has an antibacterial property, kills bacteria. Pretty convenient, because when you get sick, it's often from touching your eyes and germs going through there, your nose or your ears, but that helps to kill some of that bacteria. So destroying some information created antibacterial properties. Pretty cool. By accident over millions of years. Then at the end of that tube, we have the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. That's what it looks like magnified here. Your eardrum is like a balloon, and those air particles are banging into it, so now this balloon is just going back and forth, and it's very sensitive to even the slightest of movements. Now, if you're thinking about a skyscraper here, do you think there's more pressure on the steel that's way at the top here, or the steel way at the bottom that's holding the weight of all the other steel up? Obviously, there's a lot more pressure on the bottom here. It's the same thing in our atmosphere. There's more atmospheric pressure at the bottom than at the top, because air has weight. It's light, but it does have weight. If you were to go 1 mile up a mountain, your eardrum would experience a change in pressure of 1/2 of an atmosphere, which is about 7 pounds per square inch. But you don't have to go a mile up a mountain for your eardrum to sense a change in pressure. All you have to do is go up 1/30,000th of an inch. That's less than the thickness of a Glad wrap sheet. So you can try this when you go home, get some plastic wrap out, put on the floor and step up onto it. Don't trip. And your eardrum says, hey, the air is a little thinner up here. In fact, your eardrum can sense movements of about 1/10 of the width of an atom. Very sensitive to very, very, very slight movements. Amazing. So that's the outer ear. We're going to jump into the middle ear very quickly. The middle ear houses the 3 smallest bones in the body, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Looks like that. So here are those bones. They also call it the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, because it kind of looks like those objects. So here's that eardrum here. Then you got 3 bones here, and this is what it looks like. Here's the eardrum again, vibrating back and forth like a balloon going back and forth. And the 3 tiny bones. This last one, the stapes, is kind of like a plunger, plunging into the inner ear, which is filled with fluid, and it's going to cause shock waves to go through the fluid, and we'll get back to that in a second. Now, what's happening with this system here? Well, first of all, this system increases the sound by 30 decibels, cranks up the volume quite a bit. Why? Because once it goes into the inner ear, the fluid kills the sound, goes way down. If you've ever gone swimming in a pool, you go underwater, you can scream your head off and your friends can barely hear you. So first, it knows to increase the volume. Secondly, these little tendons that are on here, they can dampen sound. If all of a sudden there's a jackhammer going off by your head, these tendons will grab that bone to lessen the vibration, to lessen the damage to your ear. And that's got to be controlled by the brain. Then, also, these tendons can help cancel out your own speaking. Okay, this eardrum, this little balloon, is very sensitive to the slightest movements. Well, when you're speaking, your vocal cords are going back and forth like crazy. You can actually feel them going back and forth when you're talking. Well, your eardrum is just, it's going nuts, just all that motion there. But these tendons can cancel out your own speaking. If they didn't, when you spoke, you wouldn't be able to hear anything else going on around you. But it brings yours down just enough where you can still hear yourself, but you can hear other things too. Isn't that cool how that happened by accident? Then we have the eustachian tube. Here at the bottom here, it can drain anything that accumulates out in this chamber, but it does another thing. If you've ever gone up in an airplane, sometimes your ears get clogged, you can't hear as well. So what do? You yawn or you chew gum and then you hear a pop. That's this tube opening up to equalize pressure on both sides. When you're on the ground, the pressure outside your head is the same pressure inside, so that balloon can go back and forth no problem. You go up in an airplane, the pressure inside your head is the same as it was on the ground because it's trapped in there, but the pressure outside your head in the airplane cabin is lighter. So you got all this pressure inside your head pushing that balloon out, but it won't let it come back the way it wants to. It doesn't move as much, so you can't hear as well. Well, this tube opens up, equalizes pressure, now you can hear again. Isn't that so cool how that just happened by accident by destroying information? Well, that was the middle ear. We're going to jump into the inner ear lastly here. The inner ear is the most interesting portion. It comes in two parts, left and right. We're going to start out looking at the left portion here in color. You'll notice three semicircular tubes. There's one there, and then one up here. This has nothing to do with hearing, but it has everything to do with balance. Just like a gyroscope can detect motions in any different direction, so can your inner ear. And this is what it looks like inside these tubes here. This is what it looks like. You have some calcium carbonate crystals, some fluid here, little hairs connected to the nerves. And mechanically, this is how it functions. We have a guy standing up in front of a box. That's what it looks like in the tubes in his ears. He's going to bend over to pick up this box. So he bends over while the tubes move. The fluid starts to flow, moving the crystals, agitating the hairs, creating some chemicals, creating some signals in the nerves going into the brain saying, hey, you better put some pressure on your toes or you're going to fall over and crack your head open. Very complex system. If you ever get a little dizzy, it's because something's messed up here with the hairs and the crystals and things like that. But that has nothing to do with hearing. Now the other side of this thing does have to do with hearing. This is called the cochlea. Looks like a snail. Pretend it's a snake, all coiled up. We're going to uncoil the snake and cut it in half and see what's going on the inside. When we slice it in half, we see there are three chambers, top, bottom, and middle. Okay, remember that last little bone, the stapes, like a plunger? I said it was going to cause shock waves to go through fluid. Okay, pretend the snake is looking at you. So the head's right at you, the tail's away from you. And you have that last little bone. And you're plunging into its mouth. You are causing shock waves to go through the top chamber all the way to its tail. Then there's a tiny hole in its tail. And the waves go through that, and they come back in the bottom of the snake. So the waves go through the top of the snake, go through a tiny hole, and now they come back at you at the bottom of the snake. And when these shock waves go through the top and the bottom, it agitates the stuff in the middle. This is what the stuff in the middle looks like. Very complex. Okay, when those shock waves go through the top chamber, it makes this purple thing here, the tectoral membrane, makes it go back and forth. Then when the shock waves come back to the bottom of the snake, it makes this gray thing along at the bottom here called the basilar membrane, makes that go up and down. So that's all sound is. Shaking bones, balloon going back and forth, shock waves through fluid, purple thing going back and forth, gray thing going up and down. And when that happens, it agitates these little hairs in the middle here, creates some chemicals, creates signals, and then goes into the brain. So we have signals coming out of that inner ear going up into the brain. These signals get formatted in a digital format, ones and zeros, ons and offs, computerized format. Here's a question for all of us evolutionists here. What did our brains do in evolutionary history the first time they saw digital signals? Probably thought, this is really cool. I have no idea what to do with it, but it's kind of cool. It'd be like if I walked up to one of you with a CD that had Microsoft Office on it. I said, open up your mouth, you do it, put it in there, and you chomp down with your teeth. And you're like, I don't know what to do with this. There's nothing wrong with the information on it, it's just said you can't read it. So what did our brains do when it's getting these signals it's never seen before? How did it wait millions of years to figure it out? How did it survive along the way? That doesn't make any sense. Now, if you drop a pebble in a pond, you know it creates ripple marks that go out. You drop two pebbles in, you get two sets of ripple marks that go out. Well, eventually these waves crash into each other, and they create what we call an interference pattern. That's what sound is. Sound goes out in all different directions, creating waves in the air, and then they crash into each other and goes into your ear. With that in mind, let's think of a very practical example, again, keeping it simple. Let's think of all the different sounds you might hear in a restaurant. Okay? We've got music playing over the ceiling speakers, friends placing their order to the waiter, another friend talking on their cell phone, third friend telling you directly about their day. Then you've got conversations at other tables, noise coming from the silverware usage, noise coming from the cooks in the kitchen, baby crying at a table behind you, pouring rain hitting the roof of the restaurant, traffic driving by and a horn honking, and a police siren off in the distance. Every one of those sources is just vibrating air particles. And even though a friend of yours is telling you directly about their day, you're listening to the cell phone conversation because it's more interesting. Now, let's think about the police siren. Could be a half a mile away. You know what's happening at that siren? The siren is vibrating back and forth. It's bumping the air particles that are right there. It's making them go back and forth. And then those particles are hitting the next particles, and then the next particles, and the next particles for a half of a mile. And then guess what happens? They bang into the window of the restaurant. Guess what happens to the window? It starts to vibrate a tiny, tiny bit. Guess what happens to the particles on the inside of the window? They get bumped, and they start vibrating back and forth. The next particles, until it reaches your ear filled with air particles that are already vibrating different directions from all the other sounds. They bump them some more, and you're thinking, oh, police siren, it's a half, quarter mile away or something like that. I wonder what happened. How do you figure that all out? Your brain just instantly figures that all out. In fact, you hear sounds that you don't even hear. What does that mean? Let's say you're at a football game and your friend says, wow, what a play, did you see that blank in the end zone? Maybe he turned his head. You didn't hear that word, but you saw it was an awesome catch. Well, your brain will often go through like a little list of words that it probably isn't throwing in there for you. It happens instantaneously. You're not even aware of that. That's absolutely amazing. That was a quick overview of the human ear. I skipped a bunch of stuff. You can thank me for that. But here are the humble beginnings of the ear. This is the human zygote. This is actually your first baby picture. This is how all humans start out. Fertilized egg. These things are so small you could fit 10,000 on the head of a pin. You know what's inside this tiny microscopic goop? Information, pre-programmed, how to make that entire ear. Everything I looked at and more, pre-programmed in goop, and it knows how to make the auricle sticking outside your head. How it makes the shape, where to make it, when to make it, the wax, the cells that grow sideways, the balloon, everything I just taught is all sitting there, and it knows what to do and when, and how to work together. You know what else is programmed in here? Information how to make your heart. What happened in evolution first? The evolution of the heart or blood? Now, it must have been the heart. You can't live without a heart. What good is a heart without blood? Good point. Blood happened first. What good is blood without a heart? Okay, guess we got a little lucky. Heart and blood evolved by accident, same time working together perfectly. What good is that without a set of lungs to get oxygen in your blood? Without that, you're dead. Okay, good point. Lungs evolved first. What good are lungs without the heart and blood? Okay, we got really, really, really lucky. Lungs, heart, and blood evolved by accident, same time working together. What good is that without veins and arteries to distribute it throughout your body? And on, and on, and on. Absolutely amazing. I agree with the psalmist again. He says, I praise thee because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. You've all heard this verse before. Hopefully this means even a little bit more just looking at the ear. We could have looked at the eye, the heart, the brain, circulatory system, anything. It's just absolutely amazing. Now, as we end, I have one more example, and this one goes much faster, and then we'll do some Q&A. How many of you have ever seen a woodpecker? Let's say most of you have. Fascinating to watch. Here's the same challenge for us. As I described this, and this really will go fast, how did this guy evolve? By accident. One piece at a time, just oops, 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 oops. Hey, it's there. Because this woodpecker has a bunch of special features. Has special claws, tail, beak, brain, skull, and tongue. Has special claws on the back of its feet here so it can perch vertically on a tree. Most birds can't do that. They go horizontal. Woodpecker goes vertical, and it can run around the outside of the tree. The first time I saw that was a few years ago. I was like, that was cool. I've never seen a bird run around the outside of a tree like that. That was pretty cool. And he has special tail and muscle attachments in his tail to brace himself very firmly against the tree so he doesn't fall off, because he's hitting the tree really hard. In fact, he's hitting the tree so hard, if he turns his head the wrong way, he'll snap his neck and he'll be done. So he has to hit very accurately. Then he has to have a very strong beak here that won't break. And then he has a special brain skull system. He has a shock absorber around his brain. Can you imagine why he might want one? Any other bird that would try this would knock itself silly and go to McDonald's for supper. But the woodpecker has a cushion around its brain, so it doesn't affect it. But the most interesting thing about the woodpecker is its tongue. And one of the little detail here, again, it's hitting this tree so hard, if it doesn't close its eyes when it hits the tree, its eyes will pop right out of its head. So it has to close its eyes. But then when it backs up, it has to open its eyes to aim, because if it hits the wrong angle, it snaps its neck. So when it's going that fast, its eyelids are opening and closing that fast. And the brain has to control the timing of that. It would have to be programmed for that. Before I went into full-time ministry, I was doing computer programming for like 18 years. I got paid for it. Why? Because programming doesn't happen by accident. So how did the woodpecker's brain get programmed to control all that? But again, the most interesting thing about the woodpecker is its tongue. Most birds and other animals have pretty short tongues. So even if the woodpecker could get a hole in the outside of the bark, how is it going to reach through the bark into the insect tract, grab the bug, and bring it back in? Well, a woodpecker has a tongue that's up to 1.5 times the length of its entire body. Humanly speaking, if you were 6 foot tall, you'd have a 9-foot long tongue. Where would you put a tongue like that? If you store it in your throat, you choked to death. If you choked to death, you can't evolve. Well, here's what the head of a woodpecker looks like. Here's the head here, then the beak. Now, if you were to take all the feathers off the head of a woodpecker, and don't do this when you get home, this is what it would look like. The tongue comes into the beak, goes out a hole in the bottom of the beak, splits in two, goes up the backside of the skull, and gets anchored in the right nostril. And then it can stretch that tongue out, kind of like a rubber band, and grab the bug and bring it back in. It's absolutely amazing. Now, how does the woodpecker get a bug to stick to the end of its tongue? Well, it glues the bug to its tongue. Anybody see a problem with that? You glue the bug to your tongue, you swallow the bug, you swallow your tongue, you choke to death, it can't evolve. Well, the woodpecker just happens to have a chemical or an enzyme to dissolve the glue, to loosen the bug, to swallow the bug without swallowing his tongue. What did Woody do as he's waiting for this chemical to be evolved? In fact, what did he do when all of a sudden there were holes in the bottom of his beak and his food's falling out? He'd have to get some duct tape or bird tape and put up there to cover up the hole and say, you know what, I'm going to keep this thing here because this might become handy, later when I develop some other features. We can't function along. What did he do when he's waiting for the cushion, the timing of the eyelids, and all these things? No, they've all got to be there right from the beginning. And we have fossils of regular birds and fossils of woodpeckers and nothing in between. I think this is, again, evidence that God designed this thing fully formed right from the beginning. So I'm convinced that the science behind the origin of the universe, origin of life, and origin of species continually and constantly and consistently confirms that God's word is true. And we're scratching the surface here. Jeremiah 32:17 says, "Ah, sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you." And in Psalm 118:8 again it says, "It's better to trust the Lord than to put confidence in man." Do we trust many of the secular scientists who weren't there in the beginning? They don't know everything. They didn't see things happen. They make mistakes, sometimes even lie, and they're studying a world that is not the way God created it. It's been cursed. It's going downhill. It's very easy for them to come up with a lot of wrong conclusions and assumptions about the past that they never saw. So do we trust them and everything they say, or do we trust God, who was there in the beginning, knows everything, is all-powerful, and does not lie? I think it makes sense to trust God, and when you look at real science, it backs it up over and over and over. So, with that, this whole weekend has been about the ultimate authority of God's Word that can be trusted from cover to cover. It's not really about science and trying to prove things, because science never proves anything. Science can't. It just comes up with evidence to try to back up something they think might be true, but they're always discovering new things, so they have to revise their ideas. It's just how science works. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just limited. So it's about the authority of God's Word, and it's about the command that God gives us as Christians to be ready to give an answer, because the vast, vast majority of skeptics I meet are plenty intelligent. They're not dumb people. They're plenty intelligent. They're not lacking information or facts. They're lacking a solid worldview to use to interpret those facts. So it's not like we need to run around throwing extra facts at them. We need to challenge them in their worldview, and we need to be very gracious with them and caring. They need to know you care about them. You're not just there to argue with them and show them how wrong they are. Again, as I mentioned, no one wants to be wrong. But if you could be patient and kind with them and still be their friend even if you disagree, over time it could be that God works in their heart and they start to see things a little bit differently. They may look back later and say, you know what, thanks for hanging in there. I was pretty unkind to you, but you were patient the whole time. In fact, that did more to affect me than the stuff you were saying. The stuff you were saying didn't make sense at the time. I understand it now. At the time it didn't make any sense to me, but I just saw that you were being nice to me when other people weren't. And that's what's going to grab them. So we need to be doing that as we're sharing some of this information. And again, because so many Christian youth are walking away from their faith before they leave college because they don't have answers. They just were given a set of beliefs. You're a Christian, so you believe the Bible. You believe the Bible, that's why you're a Christian. And around, there's no real foundation to that because they don't have answers. That's why I was here this weekend to provide some of those answers to strengthen your faith. Again, I mentioned resources. For those of you who weren't here, we have got 9 individual DVDs. The talk I just gave here tonight is Creation Evolution, the Case from Science. So there's 9 individual titles, 12-session seminar series, the book that I wrote. We've got a few copies of that left. And we only have one set of the booklets left, but that's all back at the table if you're interested, because I don't expect you to remember everything that I just said. It's impossible. The only way I know what I know today, it's not because I'm so smart. It's just that you've been doing it a long time. So I don't expect you to remember these details. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to share them, to get you to understand them, to get you to remember and go away with the impression that, yeah, you really can trust the Bible. You want more information or want to be able to understand this better, you can get resources either from my ministry or other great ministries that are out there to strengthen your faith, to help you understand it even better, and then to share with others, friends and neighbors, classmates and things like that, who maybe are skeptics and have some great questions. I also mentioned our newsletter. Again, that comes out once a month. It's just an email newsletter. We don't have a physical one to mail out to people, but through email that comes out. I'm working on the current one for March. Hopefully it will come out tomorrow after I get home. And then again, our live events, you can help us get connected other places if you have connections to a pastor somewhere else. All we do is ask you to contact him yourself personally and get permission for me to call him directly. And then you let me know, yep, I talked to him. He said you can give him a call. Here's the name and number. And then we'll take over from there and maybe schedule an engagement somewhere else. So with that, we will do our final session of Q&A. We'll do it like we did previous nights. We'll start out with the mic and see if you guys want to come forward. So again, that way it can get recorded and other people can hear the question. And once again, I'm going to try to be relatively brief in answering the question so we can get to as many as possible in a few minutes here this evening. And I know that there were some questions submitted from Facebook from some skeptics that were there, and they were written down, but I saw the person who has them had walked out a few minutes ago. Maybe he'll come back. So if we're lacking some questions live here, I know we can bring them up from the audience, or from that. I even remember what they were. So
someone asked me last night, and probably other people are thinking about this, what happened to all the water from the flood? Where did it go when the waters were receding?
Sure. With the question of the flood, it's really easy to make fun of that story. Oh yeah, there was this worldwide flood that God was mad at everybody, so he sent this flood to flood the whole planet, but he spared Noah and his family with this cute little ark, and all the animals were on it. Well, that's a cute story. And then when you picture that cute little ark, yeah, it's easy to make fun of it because there's no way you could have fit all the representative animals on and all that again, but that's not what the Bible describes. That's what some people have come up with, little artist things, because it's cute for kids and all that. I think it's very dangerous, even though they might like to have a little cute model of the ark. It's not biblical, and it gets them to doubt it when they get older and thinking, yeah, that little ark I grew up, learning about, that's impossible. There's no way you could fit all those animals on there. So we need to be teaching it biblically accurate. And there would have been plenty of room on the ark for two of each major kind of animal, which is what the Bible says, kinds of animal, not species. Species is a modern word that we use, and they even argue about what species means. But with the flood, yeah, if you just look at it that way, you can make fun of it. But when you look at it in detail, what Scripture actually shares, and you look at real science, it's not crazy. There's so much evidence there was a worldwide flood. So where did the water go? We'll just answer that specific question. If the whole world was flooded with water, there's definitely evidence for that. We have fossils of marine creatures on top of Mount Everest. 5.5 miles up on a mountain, sea creatures, fossilized. What did some fish get kind of sick and thought, I don't want to just die in the ocean, so before I die, I'm going to flop myself all the way up to the top of Mount Everest, and hopefully once I get there, I'm going to get buried rapidly, because if I don't get buried rapidly, I won't fossilize. So he's praying the whole way up, must be a Christian fish. So he's praying up and gets up there, and he does get buried, and he gets fossilized. That doesn't make any sense. It makes more sense that that mountain was covered with water. In fact, it makes sense that the mountain wasn't as high in the past so that it could be covered with water, and it was uplifted towards the end of the flood. Psalm 104 talks about that. God says at the end of the flood, he caused the mountains that did exist to rise even higher, meaning that they weren't as high before the flood. They became higher at the end of the flood. And the valleys or trenches to go even deeper. Today, the Mariana Trench goes 6.8 miles deep. Mount Everest, 5.5 miles high. So the whole thing was covered with water, and then these mountains get pushed up catastrophically through catastrophic plate tectonics. Dr. John Baumgartner, PhD geophysicist, he's built the world's best computer simulation of plate tectonics. He's a 6-day creationist. He and I are on the board of another group called Logos Research Associates. We talk all the time. His model shows how there were plate tectonics, but it wasn't slowly over millions of years. It was catastrophic. His model actually shows that these plates in the earth, huge things, plates in the earth could move up to meters per second because of subduction and in different temperatures and thicker plates and being more dense, sinking faster. It's called runaway subduction. They start moving slowly, but they go faster and faster and faster. So you could have at the end of the flood plates subducting, one going under the other to go make deeper and deeper trenches, other plates hitting each other and pushing up, buckling the mountains up, relatively quickly in a short period of time, not over millions of years. So where did the water go? Well, you got all this going on, mountains coming up out of the water, water rushing across land, tsunamis and things like that. The water basically went back into the oceans. Today, if you would smooth out the earth like a cue ball, push the mountains down, raise the trenches up so it's nice and smooth like a cue ball, there's enough water on this planet today to flood it 1.7 miles deep. That is a lot of water. And just last year, secular scientists say they think they have evidence that there's as much water in the rocks of the earth, in the layers of the earth, as there is in the oceans today. There's probably twice as much water around as we thought. There's no problem where that water went. Basically, it went back into the oceans, and then when we have the evaporation, it comes back on the land and through rain and the rivers and streams and all that, and circulates around and around and around, which the Bible talks about that circulatory system as well, as far as the water system of the earth. So where did it go? Went back into the oceans and then into the streams and rivers and all that. So if you had any coffee or water today, you're drinking flood water. Nothing special about it. I used to travel around with a little bottle of flood water and tell people they could come up and look at it if they want, and then afterwards I tell them, it's just ocean water. It's not that big of a deal. And why did God do that? He said he did that to form a boundary on the earth so that the waters could never, ever return again to flood the earth. He said, I'll never do that again, and today it's physically impossible. Same amount of water around, but the mountains are too high and the trenches are too deep. And he said, I did that on purpose so it wouldn't happen again. That's what the Bible said, and that's what we see from real science. So it's a good question. Other question?
What about the human beings that were here? What if 95% of the fossils are sea creatures, you said yesterday? Were there not very many human beings on Earth?
Sure, the human fossils? Yeah. There are relatively very few human fossils that we find, and it makes sense according to a flood model, but not so much according to evolution. If we've been evolving from an ape-like creature for 6 to 10 million years, we should see a fair amount of those that got fossilized over 6 to 10 million years. We see relatively very few compared to all the other fossils. But it makes sense in a flood scenario because a flood would bury things where they were living at the time when the flood came. But as I mentioned yesterday, creatures that are more mobile, let's say a starfish is laying on the beach. If a flood comes in that area, it's not going to say, hey, I got to get out of here and get up and start spinning across the beach. It's laying there, it can hardly move at all. It's going to get buried right there. But the creatures that are more mobile, mice, cheetahs, monkeys, humans, floods coming, the water's starting to come in your area, you start moving away and you start to find higher ground. The water keeps coming, so you find even higher ground. Well, eventually you find the highest piece of ground you can in your area. The water keeps coming, so animals and people may be trying to climb trees or getting desperate. I mean, picture if that was happening to you, you'd go on this hill, and you don't know that it's going to keep going, but it does keep going, so you keep going higher. Eventually, there aren't any higher hills in your area. You'd probably start climbing a tree or something. If you start climbing a tree, pretty soon you get up as high as you can, water keeps coming. And eventually, it just goes over your head and you drown, and now your body's floating in the water and all this action, your body decomposes, shortly, it doesn't take too long, you're gone. There's no remnant of you whatsoever. The only way you would get fossilized is if you were in an area and there was a landslide that buried you rapidly, then you could fossilize. Well, that would be less likely to happen with mobile animals. But, they're sea creatures. Again, they can't run away. They're going to get just buried where they are. So that's why most of the fossil record are marine invertebrates. We don't expect to find many humans or bears or antelopes or monkeys or anything like that, and we don't. So it really matches up much better with a flood scenario.
Why do some evolutionists think that animals to evolve takes billions of years when most animals don't even live to be hundreds of years old?
Why does it take millions of years for the animals to evolve, but most animals don't live that long? Good question. Evolutionists typically say they believe in evolution, but you're not going to see it because it happens so slowly that in your lifetime in living, 70, 80, 90, 100 years, it's going too slow. You're not going to see it. But if you could step back and live for a few million years, you would maybe see some of these changes. They say it happens so slowly, you're not really going to see that. Well, that's a nice story, but we should still be able to see certain changes happening in our DNA and in genetics to show how that could possibly happen, that if what we see now could keep happening over and over and over, that would account for things getting better and better. But when we look at our DNA and see the changes, it's actually going downhill. Yeah, we do see changes, but it's getting worse and worse. Here's a quick example. Many evolutionists will say, okay, these mutations, these copying errors, yeah, most of them are bad, they admit that, but they say they're only slightly bad. So their point is, okay, yeah, they're bad, but they're only slightly bad, so it's not really going to hurt anything. That's actually a problem for them, and here's why. Let's say you get a brand new car, driving down the road, and as you drive, one particle on the bottom turns into rust. Are you going to know? You'd have no idea. Is it going to affect the car? No. And later another particle somewhere else turns into rust. You're going to know? No, you're not going to know. Does it matter? No, not really. Then another one, and then another one. It's not really mattering, but over time, they accumulate. Pretty soon you can physically see a bunch of them together. Hey, there's rust on my car. And then eventually pieces start falling off. So yeah, they're only slightly bad, but they accumulate, and all of a sudden then they're really bad. Well, with these mutations, these copying errors, yeah, most of them are only slightly bad. But because they're so slight, this natural selection doesn't know they're there. So it doesn't say, I'm not going to allow this creature to reproduce because of these small bad changes. It can still reproduce, so it's copying those bad errors. And then it adds more. In fact, every time we reproduce as humans, we're adding probably at least 100 more mistakes. So my parents, in their DNA, they had a bunch of mistakes, and when they had me, they took all their mistakes and copied those mistakes and then added 100 new ones. So I got all their mistakes and 100 more. Well, I took all my parents' mistakes, the 100 new ones they gave me, and added another 100 and gave them to my son and daughter. And then they will do the same over and over. And that's why I think I mentioned yesterday, one evolutionist said it's amazing that we're not dead 100 times over. If we've been evolving for millions of years, these mistakes should have accumulated so much that we can't even function. But they say most of these mistakes that we observe in our DNA, they probably happened within the last maybe 200 generations or so. If we've been evolving for 6 to 10 million years, why is it these mistakes are only coming up now? It matches up a lot better with the fact that mankind has not been around that long. There's so much to that, but and I'll probably stop with that answer there because I'll go into a whole other lecture there, but it's really interesting. It's called genetic entropy, and Dr. John Sanford from Cornell has written a whole book called Genetic Entropy and goes into a lot of those details. Another question coming up here.
Joey said, this is my friend, right? Okay. Talk about the ice age, or what was the weather change when the flood came and how the ice come?
Sure. Ice age is a good question. People wonder, Christians wonder, was there really an ice age, or should we say, oh no, that's just an evolutionary thing? Well, I think there's a lot of evidence there was an ice age. Secular geologists say there were multiple ice ages over millions and millions of years. And again, there's evidence there was an ice age, but secular geologists have a hard time explaining an ice age. They'll typically talk about, the Earth slowly getting colder and colder, and then we head into an ice age. It wouldn't work that way. If the Earth slowly gets colder and colder and colder, the oceans cool down too. And if the oceans cool down, you don't get much evaporation off them. Well, if you don't get much evaporation, you can't have snow to make ice sheets. It just doesn't work that way. But the flood would provide an ideal mechanism to cause an ice age. So I think there was an ice age. I think there was one, and it happened just after the flood. And here's why. The Bible says the great fountains of the deep were opened up. That's kind of what initiated the flood. Most of the water for the flood came from within the earth, these fountains of the deep. And then you have a lot of volcanic activity going on in the oceans and on land. There's a lot of evidence for that. Pacific Rim of Fire, a lot of evidence of volcanoes going off in the ocean. So during the flood, volcanoes going off in the ocean, plate tectonics happening, magma coming out and all that, that's warming up the oceans greatly. And volcanoes going off on land and spewing things up into the atmosphere, that's blocking out sunlight. So the oceans are warming up quite a bit, but the land is cooling down because the sun isn't getting all the way through to warm up the land masses. So you have generally a lot more precipitation coming down, but with less sunlight coming through, you have colder winters and not quite as warm summers. So whatever ice accumulates doesn't melt back quite as much, and then the next winter it adds to it and adds to it and adds to it. So you have an ice age that forms shortly after the flood. But eventually, as the oceans, all the tectonic activity has stopped and the volcanoes are done now, the oceans start to cool back down again, and the debris that's in the atmosphere over time settles through, and the sun's coming through again, so you start to warm up the land masses, and this ice sheets that had formed slowly start to melt back to where they are today. So the flood would have triggered an ice age, and they guess it would have lasted maybe 700 years based on calculations of how long would it take for the oceans to cool back down to where they are today. So yeah, I believe there was an ice age. Up to about 30% of the earth was covered with ice, and then it's melted back to where it is today. So the Bible actually explains, an ice age, whereas secular history really has a hard time explaining them. Another question.
Is there any evidence that the speed of light is decreasing? I read some articles on that a few years ago. I was wondering if you have any insight on that.
Sure. It has to do, and I won't go into all of it right now, but some people say, well, wait a minute, the Earth and universe can't be young because there are stars out there that are so far away it should take hundreds of millions of years for the light to reach us. But we are seeing them, so doesn't that mean that they've been around at least hundreds of millions of years, probably even longer? Good question. I won't directly answer that one right away unless someone else wants me to. Not that it takes super long, but it gets a little technical. But related to your question, some people said, well, maybe light was faster in the past, so when God created the universe, that light was traveling maybe even closer to an infinite speed, so it could have traversed most of that distance in a very short period of time, and it has slowed down to the speed we measure today. And Barry Setterfield and Trevor Norman, some scientists from Australia, kind of were working on that idea years ago, and they thought they had pretty good evidence to show that, yeah, it has slowed down, and it seems constant now, but they had some data from the past showing that it was following a certain curve and that they thought they had evidence that it has slowed down. There are problems with that particular model, but they're still looking into it, and I'm glad they are. They're just doing scientific experiments to see if that model would explain light travel and all that. It probably will turn out not to be the best solution, but why not look into it? If everything else is kind of running down, slowing down, and getting worse, why not light? That's a possibility. Most scientists that I know aren't real big on that concept, but some of them are still looking into it, and they've been able to change the speed of light and slow it down mechanically in labs and things like that. It's kind of interesting. So has it slowed down? I don't know, possibly, but I think they have a long ways to go before we could be confident in that. There are other things that could account for light traveling those distances in a short period of time, having to do with Einstein's theory of relativity, general relativity, that gravity affects time. That's one model that could possibly explain how light could travel so far in a short period of time. Another one has to do with the curvature of space. Dr. John Hartnett talks about that. Dr. Russ Humphreys talks about general relativity. Dr. Jason Lisle, astrophysicist, talks about a synchronicity model, and I won't go into those details, but he has a model that could validly explain how that light could travel in a very short period of time. So there are different models that young Earth creationists have to explain that by using known laws of physics. Another question?
Yeah, I got a question. I'm on this group on Facebook. I think it's called Evolution versus Creationism Open Debate. And I talked to the people on there, and I mentioned to them that you're going to be speaking tonight. I asked them for some of their questions that they might have. Well, I have a question here from Sean. He would ask, and it's kind of lengthy, but he says, why does creationism reject the principle of uniform material, I can't even pronounce the word.
Uniformitarianism, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Its proponents regularly reap the benefits and deny the science. Is this not a bit unfair? It seems that the only way creationism works as if you assume the laws of physics are not a constant. And he says all of science assumes the laws of physics are constant, and therefore anybody who doesn't is not a scientist. And then he goes on and he says, it is not one scientific principle above all others that creationism rejects. Or it is one scientific principle above all others that creationism rejects. So how would you respond to that?
Okay. There's an awful lot in there. We could do a whole session just on what's buried in there. And often what you need to do is unearth hidden assumptions that are in a question before you just try to answer it. And there's a lot of things in there. They say that we reject uniformitarianism. They say that we don't believe that the constants of physics are constant, laws of physics are constant, that they're changing and all this. Well, that's not true about the laws of physics. In fact, it was basically creationists, Bible-believing scientists who came up with a lot of these laws to begin with because they believed that God created the universe and He's a God of order, so we should expect to see order in His universe. So they went out to look for that and they discovered regularities in nature and they formulated these laws of science. So it's because that there is a creator we would expect regularity, but if there is no creator, there's no reason to expect regularity. Creationists and Christians don't reject science. We don't think that the laws of science change willy-nilly to account for everything. And here's a simple analogy. A refrigerator. A refrigerator works by Boyle's gas laws. Basically, it works by compressing gases and decompressing them. And the way it works is when you compress gases, they heat up and they give off heat. So that's why the back of your refrigerator is usually a little bit warm, because there's a compressor compressing gases, and so heat's given off. Now you take these compressed gases and you bring them inside the refrigerator and you expand them quickly. Well, when gases expand, they actually absorb heat, the opposite. Well, so they're inside the refrigerator, they're absorbing heat from the food and they're cooling it down, and then you take these expanded gases and take them outside the refrigerator again and recompress them, and it gives off the heat outside the refrigerator. Bring them back inside, expand them, which absorbs the heat, bring them back outside, compress them, gives off the heat, and it circulates round and round and round. You can perfectly explain the operation of a refrigerator by the compression and decompression of these gases, or these known gas laws. They do a great job of explaining its operation. But these gas laws are completely incapable of explaining the origin of a refrigerator. You cannot create a refrigerator by just compressing gases and decompressing them. That won't make the hinges and the handle and the electronics and all these things. So these laws do a great job of explaining the current operation, but they can't explain the origin of the refrigerator. With that, the laws of science we see today do a great job of explaining the operation of the universe, how we see things functioning today, but they cannot account for the origin of the universe to begin with. But scientists today are trying to do that. They're trying to use the known laws today that explain its operation to explain its origin, and that's where it breaks down. So creationists don't deny that the consistency of these laws. We know that God created this universe to operate under these consistent laws so that we could expect consistency throughout nature, and we could design buildings and be engineers and all that using these constant laws. But God himself wasn't confined by these laws, like, oh, I want to create something, but I have to work within these laws. He miraculously brought it into existence to begin with, but once it was here, it follows these natural laws. When I put water in my freezer and it hardens into a solid ice, I don't think that Jesus is magically going into my freezer and performing a miracle to get the water to become solid. No, it's just following the natural laws that God created for his universe. So we don't deny these laws at all, and again, we're the ones that came up with a lot of these to begin with. And as far as uniformitarianism, quick history, because it's very interesting, because it kind of goes against, you can see what this person is saying. They don't understand the truth behind this, but often they'll make these claims, they'll talk to a Christian who's maybe not that educated either, and the Christian doesn't know how to respond, and the Christian thinks, well, maybe they have a point, I don't know what to say. Here's quick history. For much of the history of Christianity, and from all of time, we realize that there's a lot of stuff that's happened in our planet, especially Scripture tells us, there was a worldwide flood. That's catastrophic. And we would look around and we would see the Grand Canyon and Mount Everest and all these things and say that was catastrophic processes that formed these things. Well, there was a man named Charles Lyell who came along just before Darwin, and he was looking around and said, you know what, I don't think it was catastrophic processes that formed the Grand Canyon and Mount Everest and all these other things. I think it was just the natural, uniform processes that we see today. We all see wind and rain, a little bit of erosion here or there, slow, it can, if the wind blowing on some dirt or whatever, could form little layers over here. We can actually see that happening today. He said, those are the only processes that we're allowed to use to try to explain the past. So now when you're looking at Grand Canyon, you can't say it was a catastrophe or a flood. You have to say, no, we have to account for that by these slow, uniform processes that we observe today. Why did he say that? Is there anything in science that demands that? No, that's his philosophy. He did not want to believe what the Bible said. So he says we can't go to God or say there was a catastrophe or the flood or anything like that. We just have to explain everything naturally, apart from God. That was his decision, a philosophical decision. Well, if it's true, if it's only slow, natural processes, this uniformitarianism, yeah, that would take millions of years to form that canyon. And scientists then said, okay, this Earth isn't young, it doesn't have a catastrophe, it's got to be really old because we're just dealing with slow natural processes, which would mean the Earth has to be millions of years old, probably billions. So the age kept changing and getting older as they discovered more things. Well, scientists for many years believed that the Colorado River carved out the Grand Canyon. They said it was a little bit of water over a long period of time. Just slow natural processes we see today, rivers, over long periods of time. Well, most of them today say, that doesn't cut it. It doesn't. It was a lot of water over a relatively short period of time. Now, they don't want to say they believe in the flood, but they're admitting, no, it was a lot of water, probably like a dam built up in the U.S. in that area. The dam breached and went through there and carved out the canyon in a relatively short period of time. That's what creationists believe, that at the end of the flood, you got all these layers that were laid down all over the planet, during the flood. Sedimentary layers, still relatively soft. You've got water building up in that part of the United States, and a dam breached, and it went and it carved out the Grand Canyon in a relatively short period of time. Sediments were relatively soft, and we see things like that happening today with dams breaching, goes through solid concrete with rebar, because of cavitation, some other processes that we see today. Imagine a worldwide flood, what that would do. If it was a river slowly going through the Grand Canyon, rivers create deltas. As they're going through, they're pulling some sediments here and there, and they start to build a little bit of a delta at the end of the river. You can imagine the size of the delta that should be at the end of the Grand Canyon? All that sediment should be there in a huge delta? There's no delta, because it happened catastrophically, a short period of time, washed out into the ocean. So uniformitarianism is a process that most secular geologists today reject. They say, no, most major features of the earth were formed by catastrophic processes. There's some uniformitarianism going on in between those things, but it's mainly a catastrophe here, catastrophe there. They don't want to tie them all together in one global flood, but they say, well, yeah, there was a flood here, yep, water here, catastrophe there, yeah, another one here, another there. So they're trying to get around that. They basically reject uniformitarianism, which is what Lyell brought up before Darwin's time. So the person who's asking the question probably isn't maybe up to date, knowing that that's something that they used to believe a long time ago, but most geologists today, secular geologists, don't buy into uniformitarianism. Well, another question.
I have another question actually from, his name is Frank. He would ask, how is antibiotic resistance in bacterial pathogens explained?
Sure, excellent. Antibiotic resistance. Great question. And I mentioned before with the question that you had brought up about, why don't we see evolution if it, because it supposedly happens so slowly over millions of years, you're not really going to see it. And most evolutionists will say that, but here's an exception. Here they say, this is an example of evolution right before your eyes. And I've always been talking about, evolution is basically that historical science, making guesses at what happened millions of years ago when we weren't there to see it, not operational science where you can repeat stuff in the laboratory and see it right in front of you. But here's an example of where you see something in the laboratory right in front of you, and they say this is proof of evolution right before your eyes. Here's how it goes. Let's say there's a little girl, and she gets sick, really sick. So the parents take her to the doctor. Doctor does some tests. Oh yeah, she's got this bad strain of bacteria going around. We all have bacteria in our body. A lot of it's good, some of it's bad. So she's got this strain of bacteria going around, bad. He says, but don't worry, we have an antibiotic. We can give her a shot, and she'll be okay. It'll get rid of that. So they give her a shot. She goes home, and she starts to feel better. But then she starts to feel sick again. Parents are a little surprised. Well, let's take her back to the doctor. Take her back. They said, oh, that's okay. We'll give her another shot. So they give her another shot. She goes home, and this time doesn't seem to be helping much. So they go back to the doctor the third time. And he does some more tests on this bacteria, and he says, her bacteria have evolved resistance to our antibiotics. Our antibiotics don't work anymore because they've changed. They have evolved. We have to give her a new antibiotic now. So they do. So what they say is, see, that much evolution happened in a short period of time. Imagine how much change could happen over millions and millions of years. And they teach that in the school systems. And the non-Christian students look at that and say, it makes perfect sense to me. You can't deny evolution. They have proof of it in the laboratory. But the Christian students do the same thing. They say, you know what? Can't argue with that. It's in the laboratory. They've got it right in front of them. Proof of evolution makes sense to them too. Now, I mentioned yesterday Paul Harvey, that he would always tell us the rest of the story. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story now, where you're going to see this isn't evidence for evolution. Here's why. This is how an antibiotic works. We create it in such a way that when you introduce it into your system, these bacteria see it as food. They absorb it through their cell wall or cell membrane, and then they have an enzyme that they use to break it down, like chew it in a sense. They break it apart to digest it, and that's when it gets converted into a poison. We design it so that when it gets broken apart, it converts into a poison and it kills these bacteria. That's how antibiotics work. Well, now in this little girl, she had a lot of those bacteria that when they brought that antibiotic in, they were breaking it down, turning into a poison, they were killing themselves. But there's millions and millions and millions, probably billions of these bacteria in her body. As they are reproducing, some of them undergo mutations. They're making mistakes in their DNA. In some of these mistakes, they are destroying the information that makes the enzyme that breaks the antibiotic down. So now in her body, she's got a lot of this bacteria that's bad, that has the enzyme that can break the antibiotic down, but she's got some mutant bacteria that lost the information to make that enzyme to break the antibiotic down. So now the antibiotic comes in to all the bacteria. They're normal bad bacteria. They absorb it, they break it down, convert it to a poison, they die off. They're gone. But those mutant ones, they pull it in, they can't break it apart because they lost information to make that enzyme. So they survive. So they reproduce more of themselves and more and more and more. Now you got millions of these new mutants that are all resistant to the antibiotic. So did they become resistant? Yes, they did. Is there a change there? Yeah, definitely changed. But it happened through the loss of genetic information. They didn't gain new information to fight this antibiotic. They lost information to make that enzyme, and they're not as healthy as a normal bacteria because they're not aided in breaking their food down as well. But they happen to survive when the antibiotic is around. But when there's no antibiotic, they usually get outcompeted by the other bacteria. So they did become resistant, but they became resistant by losing genetic information. If you continue that process over time, it gets worse and worse and worse. Pretty soon they can't even live anymore. You can only lose so much information. They will never get that resistance back because that information is gone. So yes, a change happened. Yes, they became resistant, but it was through a loss of information. They will call that a beneficial mutation. And I think there are beneficial mutations where it confers some little bit of an advantage to something, but it's always through a loss of information. It's not gaining new information to turn a single cell organism into a human being or create wings and eyes and all this. So there's an example of a change, a real change, real resistance, but it was through a loss of information. And there are a lot of other examples of flies losing wings, then they don't get blown off into the sea when the climate changes and the winds pick up. But that was a benefit to them to lose their wings. Now they don't get blown out into the ocean, but is it really a benefit? They lost something. When the climate changes back again, it's not as windy. Now the frogs are coming, and a few flies that did survive with the wings, they're flying away, but the ones that don't have wings, they get eaten. It's not really an advantage. And there are many other examples like that where overall it's not an advantage, but maybe in a narrow definition of the word, it helped them, but it was still through a loss of information. But evolution requires gaining new information all along the way, and we don't see that. So another question. You come up.
Why do some evolutionists believe that, like, from Grand Canyon takes millions of years, but when Mount St. Helens erupted, it created the mini Grand Canyon, and it's smaller, but it's still similar to the Grand Canyon, similar layers in it, and it happened in a short period of time when Mount St. Helens erupted?
Great question. You're actually obviously very well read and very educated. Again, for most of geologic history, when they've been teaching it, they've been teaching that it took millions of years to form the Grand Canyon. They say, well, that would obviously take millions of years to form the layers, but yet when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it laid down hundreds of feet of layers in hours and days. At one afternoon, there's this whole 25-foot layer that looks like it would take hundreds of thousands of years to form, but it happened in one afternoon. And it did. In 1982, there was a related mud flow that went through and carved out a 1/40th scale Grand Canyon in a few hours through solid rock. Again, it doesn't take long periods of time. Water can be catastrophic because of cavitation. When water flows a certain way, it can form these bubbles in the water. And what happens is because of pressure changes, these bubbles, instead of like exploding, they implode. Well, they implode so powerfully that when they collapse, it sends shock waves back out. And it can rip through huge pieces of concrete and rebar and all that. Again, there was one dam, not the Hoover Dam, it was another dam where it looked like the water was going to breach the dam. So what they do is they open up spillways on the side to let some of that extra water go around the side so it doesn't go over the top of the dam and do damage. Well, when they opened up these spillways, there was so much water going through. There are these huge concrete tubes with a lot of rebar in them. So much water went through in a short period of time, it ripped out huge boulders, in a sense, of concrete with rebar in there in a few minutes because of the cavitation that happened of these explosions. The force is unbelievable. That was just a little bit of water going through some tubes on the side of a dam. Imagine a worldwide flood and the cavitation and other things that could be going on and the damage it can do in a very, very short period of time. So, great question. Was there another question somewhere else?
I was gonna ask, where did they get the names for these different eras, like Mesozoic, Cretaceous, and how many million years each one of them were? Is it just made up?
Typically, yeah, with the geologic column, they assigned it names and ages. They assigned the ages before they even had radiometric dating or anything. They just said, well, this probably would have been 100 million years ago, and that was maybe 300 million years ago. And most of those layers have meanings. Mesozoic is middle age, and Cenozoic recent age, so they have some meanings behind them. But basically, they went with the assumption that evolution is true, and it would take millions of years to form all these layers. So they kind of went with some estimates on that, and then also the evolutionary story of how there'd be simpler life at the bottom and more complex life on the top. But we really don't have those ages verified consistently by radiometric dating. And let me maybe make just some brief comments about radiometric dating. That's another one of those things that intimidates a lot of people. It's like, well, they got these uranium-238 decays in the lead-206, and it's science, and you just can't argue with that. It shows the Earth is billions of years old. You can't argue with it. Well, you can, because there are a number of assumptions behind this, and I'll say this very briefly. There's 50 million things we could say about this, but there are no clocks in nature. No clocks in science you can use to give you an age of the Earth. None. All we have are processes. Processes we observe today, right now. We see a process going on, and by making certain assumptions about it, we turn them into clocks. Let me give you a simple example. Again, I like to try to keep things simple because there's no benefit in just talking really technical where you're like, that sounds cool, but I have no idea what it means. So let's say you're walking through your kitchen. You see a glass of water in the sink, and the faucet's dripping slowly, maybe one drop every second or something. And you see the glass is half full. You're trying to figure out how long has that glass been there. Well, you do a calculation, well, how long would it take to fill the glass halfway, one drop a second? So you say, yeah, it's probably in there about 45 minutes or something. So now you know the glass has been there 45 minutes. You just made 3 assumptions that you probably weren't even aware of. One is you're assuming when the glass was put there, it was empty, and that all the water you see now came from the slow dripping. But you don't know that. You weren't there when the glass was put in the sink. You were assuming it was empty, but you don't know that. Secondly, you're assuming that when the water dripped in there, none of the water that dripped in there leaked out through, maybe there's a crack in the glass, and it was slowly leaking out as well. So it's dripping in, but it's also leaking out. You're also assuming that no water from any other source is put in there. What if someone else walked through the kitchen, they were drinking a glass of water, and they just dumped some of it in there and then walked off? So now a whole bunch of water went in there really quick from some of the glass. You're assuming that never happened, but you don't know that either because you weren't there to see that. Thirdly, you're assuming the dripping from the faucet was always the rate you're seeing right now. You know the rate right now. That is a process you're observing now. But you don't know that was always dripping 1 drop per second 2 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, an hour ago, 2 days ago. You weren't there to see it. You have to assume it's always been 1 drop. By making all those assumptions, you could come up with 45 minutes. But if you're wrong in any of those assumptions, your time is off. And the thing is, you don't know any of those assumptions. You have to guess at those. It's the same thing with radiometric dating. Uranium-238 decaying into lead-206. You assume that when the rock forms, there's none of this lead here to begin with. So any lead you see today came slowly from the uranium. You don't know that. And there are rocks that form today through volcanoes and all that lava that have some of those elements in them right away. But they assume they weren't there to come up with old ages. You're assuming that the uranium, we can observe that process today. It decays very slowly. But you're assuming it's always been very slow. But you don't know that because you weren't around to observe it 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 2 million, 2 billion, or whatever. You don't know that. And then also, when that rock formed, whenever it formed, you're assuming that it was protected from the environment, and so that none of these other elements got into it, like someone pouring their water into your glass. Nothing else went into it from somewhere else, and anything that did decay stayed in it and didn't leak out. You don't know that, especially if you say it's a billion years old. How would you know that for a billion years nothing else affected it? When we know groundwater today going through rocks can bring elements in and out. And just one final comment about that. we do know that uranium-238 decays very slowly. As we watch it today, its half-life is about 4.5 billion years. Now, people think, wow, that shows things are old. No, that doesn't mean anything is old. That just means if you were watching something today, uranium, a pound of uranium, you'd have to stand there for 4.5 billion years for it to decay to half a pound. It doesn't mean it's old and it's been around a long time. It just means right now it's decaying very slowly. And they assume that it's always decayed slowly, which is, if it has, that would be pretty good evidence that rock is 1 billion years old. But there's some very good scientific evidence today to show us that those rates probably weren't constant. There was probably a period in Earth's history where those decay rates were sped up greatly, up to maybe 1 billion times faster than we see today, which would mean a rock that they say is 1 billion years old could have formed in 1 year, probably the year of the flood. They're guessing that during the flood, because of different things that were happening, it could be that these radioactive decay rates were sped up greatly for a short period of time. So that what we would think would take 4.5 billion years to accumulate all that lead, it could have decayed so quickly that it got there in a very short period of time. Here's the evidence in a nutshell without getting too technical. When that uranium decays into lead, and lead is stable, it doesn't decay anymore, the lead-206. As it's decaying, it goes through about 16 other elements, and then finally it hits lead-206 and it's done decaying. Well, along the way, when that's happening, it's kicking off, 8 different times, it's kicking off helium atoms. So, keeping it simple, when uranium decays, it creates helium. Well, helium is very slippery. It doesn't want to interact with other things, so it goes out of these crystals where we see it into the granite rocks, and then out of the granite rocks into the atmosphere and hangs out in the atmosphere. It's too light to get going out of our atmosphere. So uranium decay creates helium. Well, if the rock is 1 billion years old, it formed 1 billion years ago, that's plenty of time for all the helium to leak out and be gone. We really shouldn't be seeing hardly any helium at all in the rocks anymore if it's been around 1 billion years. But when they measure the helium that's in there, there's a fair amount still there. Meaning, okay, apparently that much decay has happened, but it must have happened so quickly there's not enough time for the helium to have gotten out of there. It must have happened much quicker than normal. And then they do their measurements, and I've got graphs on it showing that it's amazing how it matches up with the creation model of 6-day creation, but it's way, way off if there was a Big Bang and things are billions of years old. So that's an area where they're doing some really great scientific research showing that their assumptions about these dating methods are wrong. And I will say one other quick thing, because this is a broader thing. I don't think those assumptions are very trustworthy, but let's for a second say they're all accurate. Decay rates are always constant, and that the glass was empty to begin with, and nothing leaked out, and all those assumptions we just went over. Let's just say they're all true. Probably not, but let's just say they are. Even if that's true, 90% of all the processes that we observe today that we could maybe turn into a clock if you make assumptions, 90% of them yield ages that are far too young for the Big Bang to be true or evolution. So if you're just going to go with that and those assumptions, you've got to conclude things are relatively young. But they'll say, well, no, but those have to be wrong because we know evolution is true and the Earth is old. So they throw those out and they just hang on to a few that give you old ages, making those bad assumptions. And this is how it happens. They dig up a bone, and the scientist brings it into a laboratory. He wants an age for the bone. So he goes into the lab and he says, well, what is that? Well, it's a T-Rex tooth. Okay, well, where'd you find it? Well, we found it in this layer here. Why does the scientist care? Just give us a date. Well, he cares because he wants to know how old is this supposed to be. Oh, if you found it in that layer, we know that layer is 65 million years old. So that bone should be about 65 million years old. So if the bone is that old, we can't date the bone because you can't carbon-14 date it because there shouldn't be any carbon-14 in it. That would be long gone, so we can't even date this bone. So what do? Do they date the layer where they found the bone? No, because that's a sedimentary layer. You can't do radiometric dating in sedimentary layers. So what you have to do is you have to bring in a nearby igneous rock that was by that layer where the bone was. So then they do that. So now they have a rock close to where the layer was and the bone and all this, and they start doing radiometric dating. Uranium, lead method, rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon, different varieties of radiometric dating. They do all these dates on them. One of the methods says this is 112,000 years old. Oh, that's way off. That's way too young. We know there's a problem with that method. So then they do the next method. The next method says it's 1.2 billion years old. Well, that's way too old. We know that one's wrong. Probably some contamination or something going on there. We can throw that one out because we know that's wrong. Then the third method says it's 67 million years old. That's what we thought. We thought it was about 65 million years old. We used rubidium strontium, said it was 37 or 67 million years old. That's what they published. So now, on the magazines, TV, articles, we discovered this T-Rex bone. We thought it was about 65 million years old. We used rubidium strontium radiometric dating on it, said it's 67 million years old. And the public goes, wow, these guys are so smart. How do they do that? Man, I wish I was that smart. And that's literally what happens. And you don't know all the other ones they threw out because they didn't match up with what they were supposed to be. So science is not black and white. Scientists are not these unbiased people that are just following wherever the evidence leads. Now, if they're making cell phones, it typically happens. They're like, yeah, you want a better metal conductor? They'll test different ones, whichever one's the best, that's the one that they'll use, unless their cousin owns a zinc mine and they might want to use the zinc, even if it's maybe not as good of a conductor. That can happen. But generally, yeah, they're generally unbiased when they're doing operational science. But if they're trying to prove their theory about some cure or something in the past, a lot of biases come in there, and they can tweak the data, and they can make numbers say anything that you want them to say. So kind of disappointing once in a while. It has a lot to do with worldviews and agendas that are out there often. So we'll maybe take one more question, because I don't want to keep you all night, and then I'll be again at the table afterwards if you have additional questions. Well, we can take another one.
Hi, it's about the age of the sun from the Big Bang. A lot of people say this millions of years ago, but when we test the date of the sun, when they study it, it's actually a really young sun.
There are evidences that the sun is young. There was one line of evidence that was used for a number of years that we really shouldn't use anymore because we have better understanding of the operation of the sun. In the past, they thought maybe the sun was powered by gravitational collapse, that as it was collapsing on itself, it was pushing energy out in the heat. And if that's true, they were estimating that it's probably shrinking about 5 feet every hour. Now, it sounds like a lot, but it's only like 0.1% every 100 years, so we didn't have to worry about it burning out real quick or anything. But at that rate, meaning an hour ago it was 5 feet bigger, 2 hours ago it was about 10 feet bigger, and we kind of extrapolate out, well, how far in the past can you go and have a sun that big and still have life possible on the Earth? That scenario showed the sun must be relatively young, not trying to come up with an exact age for the sun, but just saying it can't be 5 billion years old, which is about what they guess for the sun. It just can't be anywhere near that because it's shrinking. So, a million years ago it would have been so big it's too hot on the Earth, couldn't have life here. But now they're pretty sure that today it works by nuclear fusion, and so it's not gravitational collapse. So using that method, that's not a method, an argument to show that it's young. But there are other evidences that it's young, and I won't go into all those right now, but it has to do with the distance of the Earth to the moon. It has to do with a bunch of other things. So there are great evidences for the sun, for the moon and the Earth to be relatively young. Even the Earth-Moon system, the moon is moving farther away from us each year. It gets, I can't remember now if it's 1.5 inches further away every year. So it's slowly receding, getting further away from us. Well, you work backwards. It was closer to us in the past. And you can't keep moving it until eventually the moon is touching the Earth. Actually, what happens is as you're moving it back, you get to a certain distance, they call it the Roche limit, where the gravitational pull of the Earth is so strong it just blows the moon apart. And by using that method, just looking at a process we see today and running it backwards and assuming constant rates, which they're the ones who want to say everything's constant, that shows that the system is far too young for a Big Bang to be plausible. The moon is pretty close to us. We know more about the moon than anything else because it's so close to us, and they don't have a clue where it came from. There's all these different theories. Oh, maybe when the Earth was forming, a chunk went out from the Earth, and that formed the moon. That doesn't work with physics. Well, maybe it was a body that was coming through our atmosphere and got captured by the Earth into our orbit. That doesn't work either, because it's either going to be going this direction and be kind of caught because of gravity just into a different angle and go off and never be seen again, or it'll be caught into an orbit and then spiral into the Earth and crash. So they can't even figure out where our moon came from, and it's right there. But they're telling us where all these stars came that are supposedly 100 million light years away and all that. They really don't know these things. They're making guesses. And when you consistently look at the real world around us, you keep seeing reasons to reject these ideas like the Big Bang and chemical evolution and biological evolution and all that. And it turns out that Scripture's right all along. We don't have to be intimidated by science. True science always backs us up. And so we shouldn't be ashamed of this. which should make you more bold when you're sharing the gospel message. Because you don't have to say, well, yeah, maybe Genesis is all messed up, but you trust Jesus. That doesn't make any sense. If you're saying there are any problems in the Bible, there is no reason to trust Jesus. Because we learn about Jesus from the Bible, and if there are other parts wrong, how do you know that Jesus stuff is right? Well, I just kind of know. So then you're asking someone else to trust you, that somehow you figured it out, but you don't have any reasons. We don't want them to trust us. We want them to trust God's Word, and we want to give them a few reasons why this is trustworthy. That's why the resources are out there, so that you can learn just a couple sample resources, so that when you run into someone who's a skeptic, and you tell them the gospel message, and they say, I'm not going to believe that because the Bible's filled with errors and contradictions, there's no evidence that was written by God. So then you learn how to ask them back, okay, what would you accept as evidence that God wrote the Bible? What would that look like? And they'll say, well, I don't know, but I know there's no evidence. How do you know there's no evidence if you don't have any criteria? If you don't have any criteria, we can't even have a discussion. And then you, at that point, should give them a few examples of reasons why this must have been written by God because of the prophecies that have come true. There's no way these guys are going to sit down and make this stuff up and get it right every time. The science, I'll end with this, truly end with this. I'll close in prayer after this. Here's just one example of something in the Bible that is related to science that was written a long time ago before we had microscopes and telescopes that modern science today is telling us, wow, that's true. How did these guys know that? They wouldn't have. They couldn't have just made it up. It's evidence that God said, write this down. I know you don't understand it yourself, but write it down because it's accurate. You're going to find out much later when you have modern science that it was right all along. But these guys could not have just made this stuff up and be right about it. They could do it once in a while and get lucky, but they couldn't do it over and over and over, which is what we see in the Bible. They did it over and over. Here's one example. Moses. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, we learned from the book of Acts that Moses was raised in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Now today, if someone graduates from the University of Chicago or MIT or Harvard or Cornell or wherever, and then they write some books, you would expect that much of what's in those books is what they learn when they're at the universities. And they get all their education and then they write all these books. That's kind of how it works. So Moses goes to Egypt, he graduates, and then he writes 5 books, the first 5 books of the Bible. So we should expect to see Egyptian wisdom in the Bible. That's where he got his education. Is that what we see? Here's an example of Egyptian wisdom. The Ebers papyrus, written about 1550 BC, contains over 800 magical formulas and remedies for things. And here's an example of one of the remedies. You get a splinter. You're supposed to apply worm blood and donkey dung. That's what they said. Modern science says, we don't know where these guys got this, but that's bad. You don't want to do that. You can get tetanus spores, which causes lockjaw. You can get really sick. You don't want to do this. So wherever these guys got it from is just garbage. You don't want to do that. That's what Moses was raised in. And he writes the first 5 books of the Bible. So do we see stuff like that in the Bible? Here's an example of what we do see from the book of Numbers. I think it's chapter 19. I'm doing all this from memory. So Moses talks about touching a dead body. Now today we know that dead bodies, you can have bacteria and germs. You don't want to do that. You can get really sick. You could even die from doing that. Well, we know that today because of modern science and microscopes and germ theory and all that. But Moses didn't know that, writing a long time ago, 1000 BC or whatever. Well, what did he say? He said that anyone who touches a dead body will be unclean for 7 days. The priest is to take some scarlet wool, hyssop, throw them on the burning ashes of a heifer, and apply that on the 3rd and the 7th day, and then he'll be clean, considered clean. Now, that sounds bizarre. If you've ever seen Beverly Hillbillies, it sounds like something Granny would come up with in the kitchen. Throw some possum in there and stir it up or whatever. And it was just, that does sound bizarre. But modern science says, no, that's not bizarre. That's really fascinating, and here's why. The cedar wood and the ashes of the heifer combined, they make lye, L-Y-E. That's a caustic soda. That's how we made soap in this country for many years. Well, if you touch a dead body, washing with soap would be a good thing. So that's the first good thing out of that. Secondly, the hyssop plant that's mentioned, that gets converted into isopropyl alcohol, thiamol, isopropyl alcohol. Kills bacteria. Touch a dead body, killing bacteria would be a good thing. The scarlet wool it's talked about, that's like an SOS pad, very abrasive, so it's a scouring thing to help get that stuff out of there. And then it says apply this on the 3rd and the 7th day. Well, bacteria grow very well in a damp environment, so you wait a few days for it to dry and then you apply it. Wait a few more days for it to dry again, you apply it one more time and you're considered clean. Well, modern science says that's a great natural remedy for that if you don't have antibiotics and stuff like that we have today. Did Moses know anything about bacteria and germs and isopropyl alcohol and all that? Obviously not. That's evidence that God inspired him to write that. If that was the only example in the Bible, I'd say, okay, you know what, maybe he got lucky. But you can go example after example after example, and at some point, an honest skeptic has to say, you know what, it's looking kind of crazy at this point. There's no way these guys just got all this stuff right. Something was going on there. That's evidence of inspiration of the Bible. That's what we have as Christians. There's so much of that evidence. It's so exciting when you avail yourself to that and read about that. All you have to do is have a couple examples in your pocket and just say, there are tons of them. Here are some examples. And say, if you don't believe that there's a God, tell me, how did these guys just making this stuff up thousands of years ago get all that right, especially with the prophecies? I mentioned yesterday that Daniel, sitting there, it'd be like if one of you right now said, you know what, they're asking me about future nations here, and I think that right now, the U.S. is the major power on the earth, pretty much going downhill, unfortunately, but we're kind of still the superpower. But we're going to fall to the Russians next. I think that's what's going to happen. And then the Russians, they'll be in power for a while, but they're going to fall to the Chinese. Then the Chinese are going to fall to Turkey and Iraq combined. And then Turkey and Iraq, they're not really going to fall to anybody. They're just kind of self-destruct. And then there won't be anyone around for a while, but then in the end times, they're going to resurrect. Turkey and Iraq are going to kind of come back again. They're going to be the final world power in the end. Could anybody do that today? You wouldn't know. They'd be guessing and getting all these things wrong. And that's what Daniel did. Daniel said to King Nebuchadnezzar, from Babylon, he goes, yeah, you're in power now, but you're going to fall to the Medo-Persians. Persians are going to fall to the Greeks. Greeks are going to fall to the Romans. And the Romans are going to self-destruct. But in the end time, there's going to be the revived Roman Empire. That's exactly what happened in history. Exactly, and that's what's happening today. I believe that we're probably in the end times, and we're seeing the European Union and all that, revived Roman Empire. That stuff is starting to happen. It's in the Bible. If there's no God, how did Daniel know all that? It doesn't make sense. I don't have faith to say he made all that up and got it right. I do have faith to say, you know what, God, you wrote this, and that's evidence of it. And there's another one, and another one, another one. So, with that, I will... As delayed promise, I will close in a word of prayer, but I appreciate you guys taking time out to be here, and I hope that you were greatly encouraged. If you're here again, you already have that relationship with God through Jesus Christ. I pray that you're just fired up, that you want to read this even more, get those examples, and that you're just itching to share the gospel message with those around you. And if you're here or listening remotely or whatever, and you're not there yet, you got lots of questions, you're skeptical, I pray that, again, tonight would be the night that you would say, you know what, I'm hearing some interesting stuff. I don't have all the answers myself. You know what, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust Jesus Christ and the price that he paid for me, that I died on that cross to pay for my sins so that I can reestablish my relationship with my Creator, spend an eternity with him, and then I can have the rest of my life, again, to look into these other really nagging questions. But don't try to do all the questions first and say, okay, I got it all figured out, now I'll believe in God. It's not going to happen because no one knows everything. Not even close. Me in particular, I have a lot of questions. But I do know that God exists and Jesus is my Savior, and I know that for a lot of evidences, but I also know that internally, and no one can refute that. I just know that I know that I know. And when a skeptic places their trust in Christ, all of a sudden they're like, wow, I know that I know that I know. I didn't think that was possible, but I just know it now. It's very, very interesting. So, close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you again for this time we've had this weekend to look into the authority of your word. We thank you that there are so many evidences, God. To me, it seems too easy to have faith because there's so many reasons, but you do give us these reasons to use the minds that you've given us, and then not to just keep it to ourselves, but to share it with others so that they can also be challenged in their worldview and to take into consideration all these great evidences for the historicity and accuracy of Christianity in your word. And we just thank you again for your graciousness and your patience you show us each day. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.